Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's story, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe to support us. Also, leave a comment letting me know which city you're watching from. Now let's get into the case. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's story, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe to support us. Also, leave a comment letting me know which city you're watching from. Now let's get into the case. Sandra Williams breathed in the crisp morning air of Washington's Olympic Peninsula, savoring the earthy scent of pine and damp soil beneath her hiking boots. At 42, she had been coming to these woods every summer since she was a child, first with her parents and now on her own, to gather the wild huckleberries that grew in abundance among the sprawling wilderness. This morning in late July was perfect. The sky a clear blue overhead, with just enough cloud cover to keep the temperature comfortable. Sandra had set out from her modest rental cabin near Lake Crescent shortly after sunrise, her wicker basket lined with a checkered cloth and a small cooler packed with a sandwich apple and water bottle tucked into her day pack. Going to be a good day for berries, she had told Mason, the elderly owner of the general store where she'd stopped to buy a new pair of gardening gloves. The old ones, worn thin at the fingertips from years of careful berry selection, had finally given out during her previous season's excursion. Weather's been just right, Mason had agreed, his weathered face crinkling into a smile as he rang up her purchase. Wet spring, warm summer. The huckleberries should be plump as grapes. You heading to your usual spot? Sandra nodded, pulling out her wallet from her jeans pocket. Up near Hurricane Ridge, there's a little meadow about 2 miles in on the switchback trail that's always been good to me. Just be careful out there, Mason cautioned, his expression growing serious as he handed her the bagged gloves. Rangers reported seeing a mama black bear with cubs in that area last week. Probably nothing to worry about, but you know how they can get. Sandra had thanked him for the warning, though she wasn't particularly concerned. In all her years of berry picking, she'd seen bears from a distance plenty of times and never had a problem. She knew the protocol: make noise while hiking, carry bear spray, and give the animals plenty of space if encountered. Her canvas hip pack already contained a canister of spray, untouched since she'd purchased it 3 seasons prior. Now, as she hiked along the familiar trail, the morning dew still clinging to the underbrush, Sandra hummed softly to herself. The tune was an old folk song her father had taught her, something about mountains and valleys and the beauty of open skies. The trail wound through dense forest before opening up to occasional clearings where wildflowers nodded in the gentle breeze. Sandra kept a steady pace, her hiking boots leaving shallow prints in the soft earth. She passed 2 other hikers heading back to the trailhead, a young couple who had been camping overnight and were returning early. "Morning," Sandra called cheerfully as they approached. "Morning," the man replied, adjusting his large backpack. "Beautiful day for a hike. See anything interesting up ahead?" Sandra asked. The woman smiled. "Lots of berries about a mile up, just past the big fallen cedar. Looked like nobody's picked them yet this season." "Perfect," Sandra said, already anticipating the sweet tart flavor of fresh huckleberries. "Thanks for the tip." "No problem," the man said as they continued past. "Just keep an eye out. We saw some bear scat on the trail near those berry patches." "Will do," Sandra assured them, patting the bear spray at her hip. The couple's warning reinforced what Mason had told her, but Sandra remained unworried. Bear sightings were common in the Olympic Peninsula, particularly during berry season when the animals were busy fattening up for the coming fall. Black bears, the species most prevalent in this region, were typically shy and avoided human interaction. Still, Sandra made sure to make a bit more noise as she continued along the path, occasionally calling out, "Hey bear," as she rounded blind corners, a habit her father had instilled in her decades ago. It took Sandra about an hour to reach the fallen cedar the couple had mentioned. The massive tree had come down during a winter storm several years back, its enormous trunk now serving as a natural bridge across a small ravine. Sandra carefully picked her way around it, noting the fresh claw marks scoring the decaying bark, where a bear had likely been searching for insects. The signs of bear activity gave her momentary pause, but the thought of untouched berry patches ahead was too tempting to resist. True to the couple's word, just beyond the fallen cedar, the trail opened up into a sloping meadow dotted with huckleberry bushes. Sandra's experienced eye could tell that the berries were at their peak ripeness, dark purple orbs hanging heavy on the branches. She smiled in anticipation and moved toward a particularly promising patch, setting down her day pack under the shade of a young fir tree. She put on her new gardening gloves, took out her wicker basket and began methodically harvesting the berries. The work was meditative, requiring just enough attention to keep her mind engaged without being taxing. Sandra fell into the familiar rhythm of berry picking, identifying the ripest fruits, gently rolling them between her fingers until they detached from the stem and depositing them in her basket with minimal bruising. The sun climbed higher in the sky, filtering through the canopy of surrounding trees and warming her shoulders through her light flannel shirt. Time seemed to slow down in the quiet meadow, marked only by the occasional call of a bird or the buzzing of insects around the sweet berries. Sandra worked her way along the edge of the meadow, gradually moving deeper into a thicker patch of bushes where the berries grew larger and more abundant. She was so absorbed in her task that she almost missed the subtle signs around her: the sudden absence of birdsong, the slight rustling of underbrush about 30 yards to her right. When she finally registered the change in her surroundings, Sandra straightened slowly, her fingers still holding a plump berry. Her eyes scanned the area, and her breath caught in her throat when she spotted them. A black bear sow, her coat glossy in the dappled sunlight, was foraging at the far edge of the clearing. Beside her, 2 small cubs tumbled playfully, occasionally sampling berries from the lower branches of the bushes. The mother was massive, easily 300 pounds, with a distinctive white patch on her chest. Her powerful shoulders shifted as she moved from bush to bush, stripping berries with remarkable dexterity for such a large creature. Sandra stood motionless, her heart hammering in her chest. The bears hadn't noticed her yet, focused as they were on their own berry picking. Carefully, she assessed her situation. The trail back to the fallen cedar was about 50 yards behind her, but to reach it, she would need to cross open ground, potentially drawing attention to herself. Her bear spray was in her hip pack, within easy reach if needed. Sandra knew the proper response was to back away slowly, avoiding sudden movements or direct eye contact with the sow. Gripping her basket in one hand, Sandra began to edge backward, keeping her movements deliberate and slow. "Hey bear," she called softly, wanting to alert the animal to her presence without startling it. "Just passing through." The sow's head snapped up at the sound of Sandra's voice, her small ears swiveling forward. The bear's dark eyes fixed on Sandra with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. For a moment neither moved, human and bear locked in a silent assessment of the situation. The cubs, sensing their mother's sudden alertness, stopped playing and huddled closer to her massive form. "It's okay," Sandra said in the same calm, soft voice, continuing her careful retreat. "I'm leaving now." The bear huffed, a deep sound. That carried across the clearing and took a few steps forward, her nose working to catch Sandra's scent. Sandra felt her pulse quicken, but maintained her slow backward movement. She had nearly reached the edge of the clearing when disaster struck. Her heel caught on an exposed root, hidden beneath the undergrowth, and she lost her balance. The basket of berries went flying as Sandra fell backward, landing hard on her bottom with a startled cry. The sudden movement and noise was all it took to trigger the sow's protective instincts. With a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the very air, the bear charged. Sandra had barely scrambled to her knees when she realized what was happening. Her hand flew to her hip pack, fingers fumbling for the bear spray as the massive animal closed the distance between them with shocking speed. "No, no!" Sandra shouted, finally grasping the canister and struggling to remove the safety cap. The bear was less than 20 feet away now, her powerful legs eating up the ground. When Sandra managed to point the spray and depress the trigger, a cloud of caustic red mist shot forward, but in her panic, Sandra's aim was off. The spray drifted to the left of the charging bear, missing its target entirely. There was no time for a second attempt. The sow was upon her, rearing up on her, hind legs to tower over Sandra at nearly 6 feet tall. Sandra threw her arms up instinctively to protect her face as the bear brought one massive paw down in a powerful swipe. The claws raked across Sandra's left forearm, tearing through the flannel and into flesh with a searing pain that pulled a scream from her throat. The force of the blow knocked Sandra onto her back, and suddenly the bear's weight was on her chest, knocking the wind from her lungs. The animal's hot breath, smelling of berries and wild things, washed over her face as powerful jaws snapped inches from her throat. Sandra twisted desperately, trying to shield her face and neck as the bear's claws tore at her clothing and skin. "Help!" Sandra screamed, though she knew the likelihood of anyone hearing her was slim. "Somebody help me!" The bear's teeth found her shoulder, clamping down with incredible pressure. Sandra felt something tear, a white-hot agony that sent black spots dancing across her vision. She was certain she was going to die, there beneath the weight of the massive predator, when suddenly the bear's head jerked up, releasing its grip on her shoulder. The sow made a strange coughing sound and backed away, shaking her head violently. Through the haze of pain and fear, Sandra became aware of someone shouting. A tall figure was advancing toward them, arm extended, a cloud of spray emanating from their hand. The bear spray. Someone was using bear spray. The bear huffed and growled, pouring at her face where the irritant had found its mark, then turned and lumbered back toward her cubs, which were now bawling in distress at the edge of the clearing. "Stay down," a man's voice commanded as he continued to approach, keeping the spray directed toward the retreating bear. "Don't move!" Sandra could barely process what was happening. Her body felt simultaneously numb and afire with pain. She could feel warm wetness spreading across her shirt. Blood, she realized dimly. Her left arm lay useless at her side, her shoulder a mass of agony, where the bear's teeth had torn into muscle and flesh. The man reached her side, never taking his eyes off the bear family, now moving away into the underbrush. He was middle-aged, dressed in hiking gear similar to her own, with a full beard and a Seattle Mariners cap pulled low over his eyes. "Can you move?" he asked urgently, finally glancing down at her. His eyes widened at the sight of her injuries. "Jesus Christ!" "I think so," Sandra managed, though her voice sounded strange and distant to her own ears. She tried to sit up but fell back with a cry as pain lanced through her shoulder and arm. "Don't try to get up yet," the man advised, kneeling beside her while maintaining a watchful eye on the retreating bears. "My name's Robert Kelly. I was hiking about a quarter-mile back when I heard you scream. Thank God I had my spray ready." "Sandra," she replied weakly. "Sandra Williams. Thank you for saving me." Robert nodded grimly. "We need to get you help right away. Those injuries look serious." He shrugged off his backpack and pulled out a first aid kit. "I'm going to try to stop the bleeding first. Then we'll figure out how to get you back to the trailhead." As Robert worked to bandage her wounds with supplies from his kit, Sandra drifted in and out of awareness. The pain came in waves, sometimes receding enough for her to think clearly, other times crashing over her with such intensity that she could only grit her teeth and try to breathe through it. Robert talked constantly as he worked, his voice a steady anchor that helped keep her conscious. "I'm a wilderness first responder," he explained, as he carefully applied pressure bandages to the worst of her lacerations. "Volunteer with search and rescue out of Port Angeles. We're about 3 miles from the Hurricane Ridge Visitor Center. I've got a satellite phone in my pack. Going to call for help as soon as I get this bleeding under control." Sandra nodded weakly, unable to summon the energy for a verbal response. She could feel herself going into shock, her body beginning to shiver despite the warm July air. Robert noticed and pulled an emergency blanket from his kit, draping the silver material over her body. "Hang in there, Sandra," he urged as he reached for his satellite phone. "Help is coming. Just focus on staying awake for me, okay?" While Robert made the call, Sandra struggled to maintain consciousness. Her thoughts were fragmented, images flashing through her mind. The bear's dark eyes locked on hers, the cubs playing innocently before the attack, her berries scattered across the forest floor. She wondered, in a detached sort of way, if she would ever feel safe in these woods again. Robert's voice filtered back into her awareness. "Bear attack victim about 3 miles in on the Switchback Trail near Hurricane Ridge. Yes, she's conscious but losing blood. Multiple lacerations to the left arm, shoulder, and face. I've applied pressure bandages, but she needs immediate evacuation." Sandra's eyes fluttered open at the mention of her face. She hadn't even realized her face was injured, but now that Robert had mentioned it, she could feel a stinging sensation across her left cheek and forehead. She raised her right hand tentatively to touch the area and felt wetness. When she pulled her fingers away, they were smeared with blood. "Try not to touch," Robert advised, noticing her movement as he finished his call. "Help is on the way. They're sending a helicopter since we're in a clearing. Should be here in about 20 minutes. "The bear?" Sandra asked, suddenly fearful that the animal would return to finish what it had started. "Gone," Robert assured her, though he kept glancing toward the edge of the clearing where the bears had disappeared. "Took her cubs and headed deeper into the woods. Bears usually don't come back after they've been sprayed, but I'll keep watch just in case." The next 20 minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Robert continued to monitor Sandra's condition, checking her pulse and the bandages, asking her questions to keep her alert. The pain in her shoulder and arm had settled into a deep, throbbing ache, and the initial adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her exhausted and increasingly aware of her injuries. "Tell me about yourself," Robert prompted, clearly trying to keep her engaged. "What brings you out berry picking alone?" Sandra managed a weak smile. family tradition, been coming here since I was a kid. Speaking was becoming more difficult as her face swelled where the bear's claws had caught her. Live in Seattle now. Graphic designer. Come every summer for the huckleberries. Makes good jam, I bet, Robert commented, maintaining a conversational tone while his eyes continuously scanned their surroundings. The best, Sandra agreed. My mom's recipe. Secret ingredient is lemon thyme. Why she was sharing this detail now she couldn't say, but focusing on something so normal helped distract from the pain and fear. Robert smiled. I'll have to try that sometime. He paused, head tilting. I think I hear the helicopter. Sure enough, a faint thudding sound was growing louder, approaching from the direction of Hurricane Ridge. Sandra felt a surge of relief so powerful that tears sprang to her eyes. The sound grew until it seemed to fill the entire clearing, and then a red and white helicopter appeared over the treetops, hovering momentarily before beginning its descent. The downdraft from the rotors sent leaves and debris swirling around them. Robert placed himself protectively beside Sandra, shielding her face from the flying debris with his body. The helicopter touched down at the far end of the clearing, and two figures in bright orange jumpsuits leapt out, carrying medical equipment as they rushed toward them. Adult female bear attack victim, Robert reported as the paramedics reached them. Multiple lacerations and puncture wounds to the left arm, shoulder and face. Possible fracture to the left shoulder. I've applied pressure bandages to control bleeding, but she's showing signs of shock. The female paramedic nodded briskly. We'll take it from here, sir. Thank you for your assistance. She knelt beside Sandra, her movements quick and efficient as she began to assess the injuries. Ma'am, I'm paramedic Chen. We're going to take care of you and get you to Olympic Medical Center. Can you tell me your name? Sandra Williams. Sandra managed, her voice barely audible over the sound of the idling helicopter. Good, Sandra. And do you know what day it is? Tuesday, July 23rd. Excellent, Chen said, offering an encouraging smile as she checked Sandra's vital signs. You're doing great. We're going to give you something for the pain now, and then we'll move you to the helicopter. Just try to relax. The male paramedic was preparing an IV line, which he inserted into Sandra's right arm with practiced ease. Almost immediately, a blessed coolness flowed into her veins, and the edge of the pain began to dull. The paramedics worked quickly to stabilize her, placing a cervical collar around her neck as a precaution and carefully transferring her onto a backboard. Ready for transport, Chen announced, and together with her partner and Robert, they lifted Sandra and began carrying her toward the waiting helicopter. Thank you, Sandra called to Robert as they moved away, her voice stronger now that the pain medication was taking effect. You saved my life. Robert nodded, adjusting his grip on the backboard. Just glad I was nearby. I'll check in on you at the hospital if that's okay. Please, Sandra said, grateful at the thought of seeing a familiar face once the immediate crisis had passed. The journey to the helicopter was mercifully short. The paramedics secured Sandra inside, attached additional monitoring equipment, and within minutes, they were airborne, the clearing growing smaller below them as they rose. Above the trees, Sandra caught a final glimpse of Robert standing alone in the meadow, her scattered berries and discarded basket nearby, before the helicopter banked and the scene disappeared from view. The flight to Olympic Medical Center in Port Angeles took less than 15 minutes, but to Sandra, drifting in and out of awareness under the influence of pain medication, it seemed both instantaneous and eternal. She was vaguely aware of the paramedics communicating with hospital staff via radio, preparing them for her arrival. Chen remained by her side throughout the flight, monitoring her vital signs and occasionally adjusting the bandages when blood began to seep through. When they landed on the hospital's helipad, a trauma team was waiting. Sandra was transferred from the helicopter to a gurney and rushed inside, bright lights flashing overhead as they moved swiftly through corridors. Doctors and nurses swarmed around her, calling out vital statistics and medical orders in a language that seemed foreign to her pain-addled brain. Bear attack victim, multiple lacerations and puncture wounds. Start another IV line. Get radiology on standby for shoulder imaging. Notify plastic surgery. The mention of plastic surgery cut through Sandra's fog. Her face. How bad was the damage to her face? The thought brought a fresh wave of fear. But before she could ask, they were wheeling her into a trauma room, transferring her from the gurney to an examination table and attaching more monitoring equipment to her body. A tall woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun approached, her expression calm but serious. Ms. Williams, I'm Dr. Patel, Emergency Medicine. We're going to take good care of you. Can you tell me how you're feeling right now? Scared, Sandra admitted, her voice small. How bad is it, my face? Dr. Patel's expression softened slightly. You have several lacerations that will need attention, but nothing that can't be repaired. Our priority right now is to clean your wounds, assess the damage to your shoulder, and get you stabilized. We'll need to take you to surgery soon to properly repair the injuries. Do you have any allergies to medications? Sandra shook her head, wincing as the movement sent pain shooting through her shoulder. No allergies. Good. Dr. Patel nodded, then turned to address the nursing staff. Let's get those wounds cleaned and prepped. I want a full set of labs, type and cross for 4 units, and get radiology in here for portable films of that shoulder. What followed was a blur of activity. Sandra's clothing was cut away, revealing the full extent of her injuries in the harsh hospital lighting. The bear's claws had left deep gashes across her left forearm, shoulder, and the left side of her face. Her shoulder, where the bear's teeth had clamped down, was a mess of torn flesh and exposed muscle. The wounds were meticulously cleaned, a process that would have been unbearably painful without the medications now flowing through her. Systems and X-rays revealed that the bear's powerful jaws had fractured her scapula and dislocated her shoulder. Blood tests showed significant blood loss, but no signs of infection yet, a small mercy given the typically bacteria-laden mouths of wild animals. Throughout the examination, Sandra drifted between alertness and a hazy twilight state induced by the pain medication. Ms. Williams, Dr. Patel said, reclaiming her attention after consulting with several specialists who had been called in, we need to take you to surgery now. Dr. Kim, our orthopedic surgeon, will repair your shoulder, and Dr. Mendez, our plastic surgeon, will take care of the lacerations to minimize scarring. We'll be giving you general anesthesia, so you'll be asleep during the procedure. Do you understand? Sandra nodded weakly. Yes, will my arm be okay? The damage is significant, Dr. Patel said honestly. But Dr. Kim is excellent. You're young and healthy, which works in your favor. Recovery will take time and physical therapy, but we expect you to regain most, if not all, functionality. Sandra closed her eyes briefly, accepting this assessment. Thank you. Can someone call my sister in Seattle? Let her know what happened. Of course, Dr. Patel assured her. We'll need her contact information. She can come up to be with you during your recovery if you'd like. Sandra provided her sister Megan's phone number, and then preparations for surgery began in earnest. An anesthesiologist introduced himself briefly, explaining the procedure as a nurse inserted yet another IV line. Sandra signed consent forms with her uninjured right hand, the letters shaky but legible, as they wheeled her toward the operating room. She found herself thinking not of the surgery to come, but of the bear, where it was now, whether it would be considered a problem animal that needed to be relocated or euthanized. Despite her injuries, Sandra couldn't bring herself to wish harm on the creature that had been doing exactly what nature had programmed it to do, protect its young. In the operating room, bright lights shone down from overhead, and masked figures moved with purpose around her. The anesthesiologist placed a mask over her face and instructed her to count backward from 10. Sandra made it to 7 before darkness claimed her. When Sandra next opened her eyes, she was in a different room. The lights dimmed, a steady beeping sound coming from somewhere nearby. Her body felt heavy and distant, as though it belonged to someone else. Her left arm was immobilized in a sling and wrapped in thick bandages. She could feel additional bandages on her face, tight and restricting. Her throat was painfully dry. Sandra, are you awake? She turned her head slightly, careful not to disturb the bandages, and saw her sister Megan sitting in a chair beside the bed. Megan looked exhausted, her normally neat brown hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, dark circles under her eyes, suggesting she hadn't slept in some time. Meg, Sandra croaked, her voice raw and unfamiliar. You're here. Of course I'm here, Megan said, immediately rising to pour a small cup of water from a pitcher on the bedside table. She held the straw to Sandra's lips, allowing her to take small sips. The hospital called yesterday afternoon. I drove up right away. You've been in and out since the surgery. Sandra frowned, trying to orient herself. Yesterday? What day is it? Wednesday evening, Megan answered, setting the cup aside. About 7:30. You've been here for about 30 hours now. How are you feeling? Like I got attacked by a bear? Sandra said, attempting humor that fell flat in the sterile hospital room. It hurts. Everything hurts. Megan nodded sympathetically and pressed a button on the side of the bed. The nurse said to call when you woke up. They can give you more pain medication. A moment later, a nurse entered the room, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking softly on the linoleum floor. Welcome back, Ms. Williams, she said warmly, checking the monitors beside the bed. On a scale of 1 to 10, How would you rate your pain right now? Sandra considered this. The pain was persistent, but somewhat distant, held at bay by whatever medications were already in her system. 6 maybe? 7 when I try to move. The nurse nodded, making a note in the electronic chart. Dr. Kim and Dr. Mendez will be in to see you in the morning. In the meantime, I'll adjust your pain medication. You should try to rest as much as possible. Your body has been through a significant trauma. After administering additional medication through the IV, the nurse checked Sandra's bandages and vital signs once more before leaving. Sandra turned her attention back to her sister, who was watching her with obvious concern. "You scared the hell out of me, Sandy," Megan said, using the childhood nickname that only she was allowed to use. "When the hospital called, they said you'd been attacked by a bear. A bear, for God's sake, what were you doing out there alone?" "The same thing I do every summer," Sandra replied, feeling defensive despite her weakened state. "Picking berries. I've never had a problem before." Megan shook her head, clearly struggling to keep her emotions in check. "Well, you certainly had a problem this time. The doctor said if that hiker hadn't found you when he did," she trailed off, but Sandra understood the implication. If Robert hadn't heard her screams, if he hadn't had bear spray ready, if he hadn't been a wilderness first responder trained to handle emergencies, any one of those factors could have resulted in a very different outcome. "Robert," Sandra said, suddenly remembering. "Has he been by? He said he would check on me." "The hiker?" Megan nodded. "He was here earlier today, seemed like a nice guy, said he'd come back tomorrow. He brought your day pack. They found it in the clearing after the evacuation. Your car keys were in it, so he drove your car back from the trailhead to the hospital parking lot, said it was the least he could do." Sandra felt a wave of gratitude toward the stranger who had saved her life and then continued to look out for her even after the immediate danger had passed. "I need to thank him properly when I see him." "You can thank him by never going berry picking alone again," Megan said firmly, though there was a hint of teasing in her tone. "Seriously, Sandra, you could have died out there." "I know," Sandra admitted quietly. The reality of her close call was beginning to sink in now that the immediate crisis had passed. "It happened so fast, Meg. One minute I was picking berries, the next, she was just protecting her cubs. I don't blame the bear." Megan sighed, reaching out to gently take Sandra's uninjured right hand. "That's so you nearly get killed by a wild animal and then defend it. But the park rangers were here earlier asking questions. They said they might have to euthanize the bear if they can identify it. Something about an animal that's attacked, a human once being more likely to do it again." Sandra felt a pang of distress at this news. "But it was my fault. I got between her and her cubs. She was just being a mother. They said they'd take your statement when you're feeling better," Megan explained. "You can tell them that then. For now, you need to focus on recovery. The doctors said you'll be in the hospital for at least a few more days, and then you'll need someone to help you at home for a while. I've already told my boss I need to take some time off." Sandra started to protest, but stopped when she saw the determination in her sister's eyes. Instead, she squeezed Megan's hand gratefully. "Thank you." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the pain medication gradually taking effect and making Sandra drowsy. Just before she drifted off to sleep again, Sandra murmured, "My berries, and all those beautiful berries wasted." She thought she heard Megan give a soft, incredulous laugh, but sleep claimed her before she could be sure. The next few days passed in a haze of medical examinations, medication adjustments, and brief periods of lucidity between long stretches of exhausted sleep. Dr. Kim, a compact, energetic man with a precise manner, explained the surgical repairs to her shoulder in detail, showing her x-rays of the metal, pins now holding her scapula together and demonstrating the limited range of motion she would have until healing progressed. "The good news is that the bear's teeth missed major blood vessels and nerves," he explained during one of his visits. We were able to repair the muscle damage, though you'll need extensive physical therapy to regain full strength and mobility. I've scheduled you to begin therapy as soon as the surgical wounds have healed sufficiently, likely in about 3 weeks." Dr. Mendez, the plastic surgeon, was equally thorough in her explanations, though her focus was on the cosmetic outcome of Sandra's facial lacerations. "I used a technique that should minimize visible scarring," she said, gently removing the bandages from Sandra's face to examine her handiwork. "The deepest cut was across your cheek, but we were able to close it with subcutaneous stitches that won't leave additional marks. You'll always have some scarring, I'm afraid, but with proper care and time, they should fade considerably." When Sandra was finally allowed to look in a mirror on the 3rd day after surgery, she was simultaneously relieved and dismayed by what she saw. 3 angry red lines ran diagonally across her left cheek from just below her eye to her jawline, meticulously stitched but unmistakable. A shorter gash across her forehead had been closed with butterfly bandages, rather than stitches. Her normally oval face was swollen and discolored with bruising, making her almost unrecognizable to herself. "It looks worse than it is," Dr. Mendez assured her, watching Sandra's reaction carefully. "The swelling and bruising will subside over the next week or so. The redness of the scars will fade gradually over months. I'll prescribe a silicone-based scar treatment once the stitches come out that will help minimize their appearance." Sandra nodded, handing the mirror back with a steady hand that surprised even her. She had never been particularly vain, but the idea of carrying visible reminders of the attack on her face for the rest of her life was sobering. Still, when she thought about how much worse it could have been, she found herself focusing on gratitude rather than dismay. "Thank you for your work, Dr. Mendez," she said sincerely. "I'm just glad to be alive." Dr. Mendez smiled warmly. "That's a healthy perspective, Ms. Williams, and for what it's worth, I think you're going to heal beautifully. Some patients even come to see their scars as badges of honor. Stories written on their skin. Survivor's marks," Sandra mused, finding comfort in the concept. On the 4th day of her hospital stay, 2 park rangers from Olympic National Park came to take her statement about the attack. Ranger David Okafor was tall and serious, with close-cropped hair and an official manner. His partner, Ranger Lisa Martinez, was smaller and more approachable, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled at Sandra. "We're sorry to bother you during your recovery, Ms. Williams," Ranger Okafor began, "but we need to document the incident thoroughly. Bear attacks are rare in the Olympic Peninsula, and we need to understand exactly what happened." Sandra nodded, adjusting her position in the hospital bed with Megan's help. "I understand. I'll tell you everything. I remember." For the next hour, Sandra recounted her experience in detail, her conversation with Mason at the general store, the warning from the hikers she'd passed on the trail, finding the berry patch, noticing the bear and her cubs, her attempt to back away, the fall that had triggered the charge, and finally the attack itself. The rangers took careful notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the bear's appearance, behavior, and the exact location of the encounter. "And you're certain it was a black bear, not a brown bear?" Ranger Martinez asked. "Sometimes. Coloration can be misleading." "Definitely a black bear," Sandra confirmed. "She had a white patch on her chest, and her face was more pointed than a grizzly's would be. I've seen enough of them from a distance over the years to know the difference." Ranger Okafor nodded. "That description matches reports from other hikers in the area. A sow with 2 cubs, white chest, marking. We've been tracking her movements for the past few weeks. What will happen to her?" Sandra asked, the question that had been weighing on her mind since Megan mentioned possible euthanasia. The rangers exchanged a glance. "That depends partly on your statement," Ranger Martinez said carefully. "In cases where a bear attacks a human without provocation, park policy typically requires the animal to be removed from the population, either through relocation or, if necessary, euthanasia." "But this wasn't unprovoked," Sandra insisted, her heart rate increasing enough to make the monitor beside her bed beat more rapidly. "I accidentally got between her and her cubs. When I tried to back away, I fell. She was just protecting her young. Please don't kill her because of my mistake." Ranger Okafor's expression remained neutral, but his tone softened slightly. "Your perspective will certainly be taken into account, Ms. Williams. The final decision rests with the park superintendent and wildlife management team, but your statement that the bear was acting defensively rather than predatorily is important information. We should also note," Ranger Martinez added, "that there have been no other reports of aggressive behavior from this particular bear. She's been observed by hikers and park staff numerous times without incident." "Then please, let her be," Sandra urged. "She's just doing what bears do, foraging for food and raising her cubs. The woods are her home. I was the visitor." Ranger Martinez smiled slightly at this. "That's a perspective we don't often hear from attack victims. Most people want the animal destroyed." "I'm not most people," Sandra said with a weak smile, "and I don't consider myself a victim, just someone who had a too close encounter with wildlife." After the rangers left, promising to keep her informed about the decision regarding the bear, Megan shook her head in fond exasperation. "Only you would advocate for the animal that nearly killed you." Sandra shrugged her good shoulder. "It wouldn't be right to punish her for being a bear." Later that afternoon, Robert Kelly visited again, bringing a small potted plant and a card signed by the staff at the Hurricane Ridge Visitor Center, many of whom knew Sandra from her regular summer visits to the park. "You're looking better," Robert said as he set the plant on the windowsill. "Still pretty rough, but better than when I last saw you." Sandra smiled, genuinely pleased to see him. "Thanks to you. I don't know how to repay you for what you did." Robert waved away her gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same. I'm just glad I was close enough to help." He paused, rubbing his beard thoughtfully. "Actually, there is one thing you could do for me." "Name it," Sandra said without hesitation. "My wife's always been nervous about hiking in bear country. When I told her what happened, she made me promise to get some advice from you before our next trip. Something about hearing it from someone with first-hand experience." Despite the pain it caused, Sandra couldn't help but laugh. "So you want bear safety tips from the woman who got mauled?" "I'm not sure I'm the best example," Robert grinned. "On the contrary, you're now an expert on what not to do, which is just as valuable as knowing what to do." They spent the next half hour discussing proper bear safety protocols, making noise, on the trail, hiking in groups when possible, carrying bear spray and knowing how to use it effectively, properly storing food to avoid attracting bears to campsites, and most importantly, giving wild animals plenty of space and respect. "The truth is," Sandra concluded, "I knew all these rules. I've been hiking in these woods for decades. But familiarity breeds complacency, I guess. I should have backed out of that clearing the moment I saw them, regardless of where the trail was." Robert nodded solemnly. "Nature deserves our respect. Even those of us who think we know what we're doing can get caught off guard." Before he left, Robert mentioned that the local newspaper had run a small story about the attack. "Nothing major," he assured her when he saw her surprised expression. "Just a brief mention in the Peninsula Daily News. Seattle woman injured in bear encounter, that sort of thing." The Rangers gave a statement about bear safety, used it as an educational opportunity. Sandra was relieved that the incident hadn't generated more publicity. The last thing she wanted was to become some sort of local celebrity or, worse, to have the attack sensationalized in a way that demonized the bear. On the 6th day after the attack, Sandra was discharged from Olympic Medical Center with a comprehensive care plan, a bag full of medications, and appointments scheduled for follow-up visits with various specialists. Megan had already arranged to take 3 weeks off work to help her sister during the initial recovery period, and they decided that Sandra would stay at Megan's apartment in Seattle rather than returning to Sandra's third-floor walk-up. "You can't do stairs with that shoulder, and you'll need help with everyday tasks for a while," Megan pointed out when Sandra initially protested the arrangement. "My place has an elevator and I'm home most evenings. It makes more sense." Sandra couldn't argue with the logic, though she bristled slightly at the loss of independence. The doctors had been clear about her limitations during recovery. No lifting with her left arm, no driving until cleared by the orthopedist, assistance required for basic activities like showering and dressing due to the immobilization of her shoulder. It was a humbling position for someone accustomed to self-sufficiency. Before leaving Port Angeles, Sandra insisted on making 2 stops, first to the police station to file an official report, a formality required by her health insurance, and then to the Olympic National Park headquarters to check on the status of the bear. At park headquarters, they were directed to Ranger Martinez, who seemed surprised but pleased to see Sandra up and about. "Ms. Williams, we weren't expecting to see you. How are you feeling?" "Better each day," Sandra said, attempting a smile that pulled uncomfortably at her stitches. "But I wanted to ask about the bear before I head back to Seattle. Has a decision been made?" Ranger Martinez's expression turned sympathetic. "The wildlife management team met yesterday. Based on your statement and the bear's history of non-aggressive behavior, they've decided against euthanasia." Sandra felt a surge of relief. "Thank you. That's wonderful news. However," the ranger continued, holding up a hand, "they are going to attempt to relocate the sow and her cubs to a more remote area of the park, farther from popular hiking trails. It's a compromise solution, acknowledging that the bear was acting defensively while also prioritizing public safety." Sandra nodded, accepting this outcome. "That seems fair. When will the relocation happen?" "Wildlife specialists are tracking her now," Ranger Martinez explained. "Once they locate the family, they'll tranquilize them and transport them to the new location. It should happen within the next week or so." As they prepared to leave, Ranger Martinez handed Sandra a pamphlet. "We're updating our bear safety materials for visitors," she explained. "If you're willing, we'd like to include some of your experience. Anonymously, of course, as a cautionary tale." Your perspective as someone who understands that the bear was just being a bear might help others appreciate the importance of giving wildlife space. Sandra took the pamphlet, oddly touched by the request. I'd be happy to help if it means preventing someone else from going through this. The drive back to Seattle with Megan was long and uncomfortable, each bump and turn in the road sending jolts of pain through Sandra's healing injuries, despite the cushions Megan had arranged around her. They made frequent stops to allow Sandra to stretch her legs and take pain medication, turning what was normally a 3-hour journey into nearly 5. By the time they reached Megan's apartment in Queen Anne, Sandra was exhausted, her face pale, and drawn with pain and fatigue. Megan helped her inside and settled her in the guest bedroom, which had been prepared with extra pillows to support her injured arm and shoulder. Home sweet home, at least for now, Megan said, setting Sandra's medication on the nightstand within easy reach. Can I get you anything? Tea? Something to eat? Sandra shook her head, already half asleep. Just rest. Thank you, Meg, for everything. Megan squeezed her hand gently. That's what sisters are for. Get some sleep. We'll figure everything else out tomorrow. The first week at Megan's apartment established what would become their routine during Sandra's recovery. Mornings began with medication and a careful assessment of how much pain Sandra was experiencing that day. Megan would help her sister with the awkward process of bathing and dressing before leaving for work, having arranged to work reduced hours that allowed her to be home by early afternoon. Sandra spent her mornings slowly building up her stamina by taking short walks around the apartment and attempting simple tasks with her right hand, like making tea or preparing simple meals. Afternoons often involved medical appointments, checkups, with specialists, bandage changes, and eventually the removal of stitches from her face and arm. Sandra was surprised by how little the medical staff seemed to react to her injuries. To them, she was simply another patient, her wounds clinical puzzles to be solved rather than shocking evidence of a wild animal attack. It was the reactions of strangers that proved more difficult to navigate. During trips to the pharmacy or grocery store with Megan, Sandra became acutely aware of the stares her healing face attracted. Children, lacking adult discretion, would point or ask loudly what had happened to her face. Adults were more subtle but no less curious, their eyes lingering on her scars before quickly looking away when she caught them staring. At first, Sandra found these interactions mortifying. She would keep her head down, using her hair as a curtain to shield the left side of her face from view. But as the days passed and her physical strength returned, so too did her emotional resilience. She began to meet curious gazes directly, sometimes even offering a brief explanation when someone seemed particularly concerned. "Bear attack," she would say matter-of-factly, watching their expressions shift from embarrassment at being caught, staring to astonishment at her casual tone. "I got between a mother and her cubs while picking berries." The story became easier to tell with repetition, transforming from a traumatic event into simply another experience. Extraordinary, certainly, but no longer defining. Sandra found that most people responded with genuine sympathy and interest once the initial shock wore off, and many shared their own wilderness encounters or close calls. 3 weeks after the attack, Sandra had her first physical therapy appointment. The therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Diane with arms corded with muscle, assessed Sandra's range of motion and strength before outlining a recovery plan. "The good news is that Dr. Kim did excellent work on your shoulder," Diane said as she gently manipulated Sandra's arm, noting where movement caused pain. "The bad news is that you've got a long road ahead. We're looking at 6 to 9 months of therapy before you're back to full function, and even then, you might have some permanent limitations." Sandra nodded, having prepared herself for this reality based on her conversations with Dr. Kim. "Just tell me what to do. I'm ready to work." Diane smiled approvingly. "That's what I like to hear. We'll start with gentle range of motion exercises to prevent adhesions from forming in the shoulder joint. As healing progresses, we'll add resistance training to rebuild muscle strength." The physical therapy sessions were grueling, pushing Sandra to the edge of her pain tolerance and sometimes beyond. After each session, she would return to Megan's apartment exhausted and sore, but also oddly satisfied. Each small improvement, being able to raise her arm an inch higher, hold a cup with less trembling, button her own shirt without assistance, felt like a victory against the bear that had left its mark on her body. 5 weeks after the attack, Sandra received a letter from Olympic National Park. It contained a brief update on the bear and her cubs, informing her that the family had been successfully relocated to a remote area in the southwestern section of the park, far from popular hiking trails. Enclosed with the letter was a photograph taken by wildlife biologists showing the sow and her cubs emerging from a transport crate into their new territory. The bear's distinctive white chest patch was clearly visible. Sandra pinned the photo to the bulletin board in Megan's kitchen, a tangible reminder that despite everything, the story had a reasonably happy ending for all involved. The bear was alive and free, her cubs still by her side. Sandra was healing, slowly reclaiming her independence and strength. It could have been much worse for either of them. As August turned to September, Sandra's medical visits became less frequent and her dependence on Megan decreased. She could now manage most daily activities independently, though certain movements remained difficult or painful. The angry red lines on her face had faded to pink, still noticeable, but less stark, against her skin. The silicone scar treatment Dr. Mendez had prescribed was helping to flatten and fade the marks, though Sandra knew they would never disappear completely. "I'm thinking it's time for me to go back to my own place," Sandra announced one evening as she and Megan were cleaning up after dinner. She had managed to wash and dry the dishes with minimal help, a task that would have been impossible just a few weeks earlier. Megan looked up from wiping the counter, her expression concerned. "Are you sure? It's only been 6 weeks, Dr. Kim said." "Dr. Kim said I'm progressing well," Sandra interrupted gently, "and Diane says I'm ahead of schedule with physical therapy. I can manage the stairs now, and I miss my space. My clients are asking when I'll be taking on work again." Sandra had been freelancing as a graphic designer for years, building a steady clientele of small businesses and non-profits who valued her clean, distinctive style. The attack had forced her to put all projects on hold, and while most clients had been understanding, she knew she couldn't afford to stay inactive much longer. Megan sighed, recognizing the determined set of her sister's jaw. "All right, but I'm coming over to check on you every day for the first week, and you have to promise to call if you need help, even in the middle of the night." "Deal," Sandra agreed readily, knowing this was a reasonable compromise. "Maybe we can go this weekend to get my place ready. It's probably covered in dust by now." That weekend, the sisters thoroughly cleaned Sandra's apartment, rearranged furniture to accommodate her limited mobility, and stocked the refrigerator and pantry with easy-to-prepare meals. Megan insisted on installing additional handrails in the bathroom and replacing Sandra's heavy comforter with a lighter one that would be easier to manage one-handed. By Sunday evening, Sandra was settled back in her own space, a strange mixture of relief and anxiety washing over her as Megan reluctantly prepared to leave. The apartment was quiet in a way she hadn't noticed before, the ticking of the kitchen clock suddenly louder, the occasional car passing on the street below more intrusive. "You're sure you'll be okay?" Megan asked for perhaps the 10th time, hovering by the door with her purse already slung over her shoulder. "Positive," Sandra assured her, though she wasn't entirely convinced herself. "Go home, Meg. You've done more than enough. I'll see you tomorrow when you come to check on me." After Megan finally left, Sandra stood in the middle of her living room, taking stock of her familiar surroundings. Everything was exactly as she had left it that July morning when she had set out for the Olympic Peninsula, excited about a day of berry picking. Her hiking boots still sat by the door, cleaned and returned by Robert along with her day pack. Her favorite reading chair waited by the window, a half-finished novel marking her place on the side table. Yet something had shifted, some fundamental alignment between herself and her environment, altered by her experience. The apartment felt simultaneously too confining and too exposed. Sandra found herself checking the locks twice before bed, something she had never done before. When a branch scratched against her bedroom window in the night, she jerked awake instantly, heart pounding, momentarily disoriented, and certain that the bear had somehow found her. These moments of panic lessened as the days passed, and Sandra re-established her routines. She resumed work gradually, starting with small projects that didn't require long hours at her computer. Her clients were sympathetic when they saw her scars, though she noticed some seemed uncomfortable discussing them directly, preferring to focus on business matters. Physical therapy continued 3 times a week, each session pushing her limits a little further. Diane was impressed with Sandra's determination and frequently had to remind her not to overdo it. "Healing isn't linear," she cautioned, when Sandra became frustrated with a plateau in her progress. "There will be good days and bad days. The goal is improvement over time, not daily miracles." In late September, nearly 2 months after the attack, Sandra received a phone call from Robert Kelly. They had exchanged contact information before. She left Port Angeles, but had communicated only occasionally since then, primarily through brief text messages checking on her recovery. "Sandra, it's Robert. Hope I'm not calling at a bad time. Not at all, Sandra said, genuinely pleased to hear from him. I was just finishing up some work. How are you? Good, good, Robert replied. Listen, the reason I'm calling, I'm helping organize a wilderness safety workshop at the Hurricane Ridge Visitor Center next month. Basic stuff, how to prepare for hiking, what to do in emergencies, wildlife encounters, that sort of thing. The rangers mentioned you were willing to share your story for educational purposes, and I thought maybe you'd consider coming to speak at the workshop. Nothing formal, just a short talk about your experience and what you learned from it. Sandra hesitated, surprised by the request. She hadn't returned to the Olympic Peninsula since the attack, though she had thought about it often. The idea of going back to the place where she had nearly died was intimidating, but there was also something appealing about facing that fear directly. When exactly would this be? She asked, already mentally reviewing her calendar. October 15th, a Saturday. We'd cover your travel expenses, of course, and if you're not comfortable speaking publicly about it yet, I completely understand. Sandra took a deep breath. No, I think it's a good idea. If sharing my experience helps someone else avoid making the same mistakes, it gives some meaning to what happened. She paused, then added, to be honest, I've been thinking about going back anyway. This gives me a reason. That's great, Robert said, relief evident in his voice. I'll email you the details. And Sandra, it really will help people. Bear encounters are becoming more common as more people use the park, and first-hand accounts make a bigger impression than any pamphlet. After hanging up, Sandra moved to the window of her apartment, looking west toward the Olympic Mountains barely visible in the distance beyond Seattle's skyline. The idea of returning to the peninsula stirred a complex mix of emotions. Apprehension, certainly, but also a strange sense of unfinished business, as though her story there had been interrupted rather than concluded. The workshop became a focus for Sandra over the next few weeks as she prepared what she would say. She researched bear behavior more thoroughly than she ever had before, consulted with Ranger Martinez by email about the most important safety points to emphasize, and practiced her talk in front of Megan, who offered constructive criticism and emotional support. You're sure you want to do this? Megan asked after one practice session, concern evident in her voice. It won't be too traumatic to go back there. Sandra considered the question seriously. I think I need to go back, actually, to reclaim it somehow. Those woods have been a special place for me my whole life. I don't want fear to take that away. When October 15th arrived, Sandra drove her own car to Port Angeles, her left arm now strong enough for the task, though she took frequent breaks to avoid straining her still-healing shoulder. The familiar route along Highway 101 brought back memories of her childhood trips with her parents, stopping at the same viewpoints, marveling at the same vistas of mountains meeting sea. The Olympic National Park Visitor Center at Hurricane Ridge was busy when she arrived, filled with families enjoying the fall colors and the crisp autumn air. Sandra spotted Robert immediately, his tall figure and full beard recognizable even among the crowd of rangers and volunteers setting up for the workshop. You made it, he said warmly as he approached, giving her a gentle hug that carefully avoided her left side. How was the drive? Good, Sandra replied, surprised to find that she meant it. It's beautiful up here in the fall. I'd forgotten. Robert nodded, gesturing toward the surrounding mountains ablaze with autumn foliage. Different kind of beauty than summer, but special in its own way. His eyes flickered briefly to the scars on her face, now faded to silvery lines that caught the light when she turned her head. You're looking well. How's the shoulder? Better every week, Sandra said, rotating her arm to demonstrate her improved range of motion. I probably won't be rock climbing anytime soon, but I can function normally for the most part. The workshop was scheduled for the afternoon, giving Sandra time to reacquaint herself with the visitor center and the nearby trails. She wandered through the exhibits, paying particular attention to the section on local wildlife. The black bear display, which she had passed dozens of times over the years without much thought, now held her complete attention. She studied the taxonomic information, behavior patterns and safety recommendations with new appreciation for their relevance. A small girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, approached the display while Sandra was reading. She pointed excitedly at the taxidermied bear specimen positioned in a lifelike pose. "Mommy, look! A bear like in the story." The child's mother, catching up a moment later, glanced apologetically at Sandra. Emily's been obsessed with bears since her preschool teacher. Read them a book about a bear family. Sandra smiled at the little girl. Bears are very interesting animals, aren't they? Do you know what kind of bear this is? A black bear, Emily replied confidently. They eat berries and fish and sometimes honey like Winnie the Pooh. That's right, Sandra said, impressed by the child's knowledge. They love berries. Sometimes they even compete with people who are picking berries in the forest. Emily studied Sandra's face with the direct curiosity unique to children. What happened to your face? Did you get scratched? Emily, her mother admonished, looking mortified. I'm so sorry, she doesn't understand. It's okay, Sandra assured her, then turned back to Emily. Yes, I did get scratched. By a bear, actually. I accidentally got too close to a mother bear and her cubs while I was picking berries, and she thought I might hurt her babies. Emily's eyes widened. A real bear did that? Did it hurt? Sandra nodded solemnly. It did hurt, but the bear was just trying to protect her cubs like your mom would protect you if she thought you were in danger. That's why it's very important to be careful and give bears lots of space if you see them in the forest. Emily nodded, clearly processing this information. I would stay far, far away, she declared decisively, and I would hold my mommy's hand very tight. That's a very smart plan, Sandra agreed, smiling at the child's mother, who mouthed a silent thank you over her daughter's head. As the time for the workshop approached, Sandra made her way to the outdoor amphitheater where the event was being held. About 50 people had gathered, a mix of locals and tourists, ranging from experienced hikers in technical gear to families with young children. Robert introduced the program, explaining that they would cover basic wilderness preparedness, navigation, emergency response, and wildlife encounters. Sandra's segment came after a ranger's presentation on proper food storage in bear country. Robert introduced her simply as someone with first-hand experience of a bear encounter, allowing her to share as much or as little of her personal story as she felt comfortable with. Taking a deep breath, Sandra stepped up to the small podium. The scarred left side of her face was clearly visible to the audience, providing visual evidence that gave weight to her words before she even began speaking. My name is Sandra Williams, she started, her voice steadier than she had expected. Hi, sir. On July 23rd of this year, I was attacked by a black bear while picking huckleberries not far from where we're sitting now. I've been coming to these woods my entire life and had seen bears from a distance many times without incident. I thought I knew how to behave safely in bear country. I was wrong, and that mistake nearly cost me my life. For the next 15 minutes, Sandra recounted her experience, the warnings she had dismissed, the signs she had missed, the crucial errors in her response when she finally noticed the bear family. She described the attack briefly but vividly, not dwelling on the gruesome details, but ensuring the audience understood the very real danger posed by a defensive bear. She emphasized that the bear had not been malicious or predatory, but simply a wild animal responding to a perceived threat to her cubs. The bear that attacked me was relocated rather than euthanized, she told the attentive audience, and I'm grateful for that. These mountains belong to her as much as to us, more so really. We're visitors in her home. The responsibility for safe interaction lies primarily with us, not with the wildlife. She concluded by outlining the lessons she had learned: never hiking alone in bear country, making sufficient noise on the trail, carrying bear spray and knowing how to use it effectively, being constantly aware of her surroundings, and most importantly, giving wildlife abundant space, especially mothers with young. I still love these woods, Sandra said, gesturing to the magnificent landscape surrounding them. I still intend to pick huckleberries next summer, though I won't be doing it alone anymore. Wild places deserve our respect, not our fear. Thank you. The applause was warm and sustained as Sandra stepped away from the podium. Several people approached her afterward with questions or to share their own wildlife encounters. A park volunteer asked if she would be willing to record her story for the park's educational archives, and a local teacher invited her to speak to his high school environmental science class. As the crowd dispersed and the rangers began cleaning up, Robert joined Sandra at the edge of the amphitheater. That was powerful, he said simply. I saw people really listening, really taking it in. You made an impact today. Sandra smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with berry picking or graphic design or any of her usual measures of success. Thanks for inviting me. It felt right somehow, like turning something negative into something useful. Any plans while you're here? Robert asked as they walked back toward the visitor center. How long are you staying? Just until tomorrow, Sandra replied. I have a room at Lake Crescent Lodge tonight, and there is one thing I'd like to do while I'm here, if you have time to join me. Robert raised an eyebrow questioningly. I'd like to go back to the berry patch, Sandra said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Not all the way to the meadow where it happened, necessarily. but at least part of the trail, to prove to myself that I can. Robert studied her face for a moment, then nodded. I understand, and yes, I'd be happy to go with you. We have about 3 hours of daylight left, enough time to hike a portion of the trail and get back before dark. They drove separately to the Switchback Trail parking area, which was less crowded than it had been during Sandra's July visit. The fall colors had drawn most visitors to other parts of the park where deciduous trees were more prevalent. Sandra stood at the trailhead, her heart beating a little faster as memories of her last hike here flooded back. "You okay?" Robert asked quietly, noting her hesitation. Sandra nodded. "Just taking a moment, let's go." They set off down the familiar path, moving at a comfortable pace that accommodated Sandra's still healing body. Robert walked slightly ahead, occasionally pointing out interesting flora or signs of wildlife, a set of deer tracks crossing the trail, mushrooms sprouting from a decaying log, late-season berries still clinging to bushes along the path. Sandra found herself relaxing as they progressed, the familiar rhythm of hiking returning naturally. The woods felt different in autumn, the underbrush less dense, the light more golden as it filtered through partially bare branches, the air cooler and sharper with the scent of decaying leaves. Yet the essential character of the place remained, unchanged, still beautiful, still wild. They had hiked about a mile when Sandra recognized a landmark, a distinctive rock formation that marked the halfway point to her usual berry-picking grounds. Beyond it lay the fallen cedar, and eventually the meadow where the attack had occurred. She stopped, unsure whether she wanted to continue further. "This might be far enough for today," she said, sitting on a trailside log to catch her breath. Her shoulder was beginning to ache from the exertion, a reminder of her limitations. Robert nodded, taking a seat beside her and offering a water bottle from his pack. "No rush. This isn't a test you need to pass all at once." They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the forest sounds, wind in the branches, a woodpecker working industriously nearby, the distant call of a raven. Sandra closed her eyes, letting the sensory experience wash over her. The fear she had anticipated feeling was present but muted, a background awareness rather than an overwhelming emotion. "You know," she said finally, opening her eyes to gaze. "Down the trail ahead, I think I would like to go a little farther, just to the fallen cedar, not all the way to the meadow. Is that okay?" "Of course," Robert said, standing and offering a hand to help her up. "Whatever feels right to you." They continued along the trail until the massive fallen cedar came into view, its enormous trunk still spanning the small ravine just as Sandra remembered. Fresh growth had begun to sprout from the decaying wood, tiny seedlings and mosses reclaiming the dead tree for the forest. Sandra approached it slowly, noting that the bear claw marks she had observed in July were less distinct now, weathered by rain and time. "This is where I saw the first clear sign of bear activity," she told Robert, running her fingers lightly over the scored bark. Fresh marks where a bear had been digging for insects. "I should have been more cautious after seeing this." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "Hindsight is always clearer, but you're here now, learning from the experience. That counts for something." Sandra stood quietly for a moment, looking past the fallen cedar toward the trail that would lead to the meadow. Part of her wanted to continue, to face the actual site of the attack, but she recognized that her body was tired and the day was waning. Some journeys needed to be taken in stages. "I think this is enough for today," she decided, "but I'll come back next summer. Go all the way then." "I'll go with you if you want company," Robert offered as they turned to head back to the trailhead. "Beth and I usually come up for a week in July anyway." Sandra smiled gratefully. "I'd like that, and maybe I'll even pick a few berries." Cautiously, of course, and with a much more vigilant eye for bears. As they hiked back, the setting sun casting long shadows across the trail, Sandra felt a sense of peace settling over her. The forest hadn't changed. It was still wild, still potentially dangerous, still indifferent to human presence, but her relationship with it had evolved, tempered by experience and a deeper understanding of her place within it. Back at the parking area, as they prepared to go their separate ways, Robert hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever think about the bear? Wonder where she is now, what she's doing?" Sandra nodded, surprised but pleased that he had asked. "All the time. The rangers told me they relocated her and the cubs to the southwest section of the park. I imagine she's preparing for hibernation now, teaching her cubs to fatten up for winter. I hope they're doing well in their new territory." "It's a good reminder," Robert said thoughtfully, "that even in our most difficult encounters with nature, there's room for empathy, for recognizing that we're all just trying to survive in our own ways." "Exactly," Sandra agreed, the sentiment resonating deeply with her. "That's why I couldn't bear the thought of her being euthanized. What happened wasn't her fault or mine, just an unfortunate collision of two worlds that usually exist in parallel. They said their goodbyes with promises to stay in touch, and Sandra drove to Lake Crescent Lodge as dusk settled over the peninsula. The historic lodge on the shores of the glacial lake had been her parents' favorite place to stay during family trips, and returning there felt like completing a circle somehow. After checking in and having a quiet dinner in the lodge's dining room, Sandra walked down to the lakeshore. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the surrounding mountains and the emerging stars overhead. She found a bench near the dock and sat, pulling her jacket closer against the autumn chill. In the distance, the dark outline of the mountains loomed against the night sky, the same mountains where a black bear sow and her cubs were preparing for the coming winter, unaware of the human whose life had intersected so violently with theirs months earlier. Sandra touched the scars on her face, tracing the lines that would remain with her for the rest of her life. They no longer felt like disfigurements, but rather like a text written on her skin, a story of survival and respect and the wildness that existed both in nature and within herself. She had come to the Olympic Peninsula that July day seeking berries, a simple and familiar pleasure. She was leaving with something far more complex and valuable, a deeper understanding of the natural world and her place within it, a renewed appreciation for the preciousness and fragility of life, and the knowledge that even the most traumatic experiences could become meaningful parts of one's journey, rather than merely tragic interruptions. The bear had long since walked away after their brief, violent encounter, returning to its life in the forest as Sandra had returned to hers in the city. But the memory of that moment, when wild animal and human being had collided, would remain with both of them, carried in the bear's wariness of human sense and in the silvery lines across Sandra's skin. Different languages for the same story, written in flesh and instinct, and the ancient ongoing dialogue between humans and the wilderness that both nurtures and challenges them. As night fully descended over Lake Crescent, Sandra stood and took one last look at the mountains before turning back toward the warmly lit lodge. Tomorrow she would return to Seattle, to her apartment and clients and the rhythm of urban life. But she would carry this place with her, as she always had, in memory and longing and the silent promise to return. The wilderness had marked her, claimed her in a way, but it had not defeated her. And in the complex calculus of nature, perhaps, that was the most one could ask for. Not conquest or complete safety, but simply the chance to learn, to grow, and to continue the journey, more aware with each step of both the beauty and the danger that walked alongside. The first rays of sunlight had just begun to break through the dense canopy of pines when Michael Davis felt the familiar weight of anticipation settle in his chest. The crisp October air carried the earthy scent of fallen leaves and damp soil, mingling with the faint trace of wood smoke that clung to his hunting jacket. For the past 15 years, these 3 days in Idaho's Salmon Chalice National Forest had been sacred, a tradition shared with his oldest friend, Robert Bobby Walsh, that marked the transition from summer to fall as definitively as the changing colors of the aspen trees that dotted the mountainsides. Michael shifted his weight against the rough bark of the ponderosa pine where he'd been stationed for the past hour, careful to avoid making any unnecessary sound. At 42, he was no stranger to the patience required for a successful hunt, though the ache in his lower back reminded him that he wasn't getting any younger. He adjusted the scope on his Remington 700, a rifle that had been a gift from his father nearly 2 decades ago, and scanned the small clearing ahead, where deer often came to graze in the early morning hours. The Salmon Chalice National Forest stretched over 3 million acres of wilderness in east-central Idaho, a vast expanse of rugged mountains, deep canyons, and dense forests that had remained largely unchanged since Lewis and Clark had passed through the region over 2 centuries ago. It was prime territory for mule deer and elk, which was why Michael and Bobby had first chosen it for their annual hunting trip all those years ago, fresh out of college and eager to establish traditions of their own. But the forest was also home to other predators, mountain lions, wolves, and bears, both black and grizzly, a fact that experienced hunters in the region never forgot. Michael and Bobby had arrived at their usual campsite the previous afternoon, setting up their tent near a small stream that fed into the middle fork of the Salmon River. They'd spent the evening going over their plans for the hunt, marked potential deer trails on their topographic map, and reminisced about previous trips while nursing beers around a small campfire. Bobby had been unusually quiet, distracted by recent troubles at home. His wife of 12 years had filed for divorce just a month earlier, and the proceedings were turning nasty, especially regarding custody of their 10-year-old daughter, Emma. Michael had tried to provide a sympathetic ear without pushing too hard. He knew from experience that sometimes the healing power of the wilderness worked best when given space to operate on its own. "Movement at 2 o'clock, Michael whispered. To himself, his trained eye catching the slight disturbance in the underbrush at the edge of the clearing, he slowly raised his rifle, peering through the scope to identify the source. For a moment there was nothing, and then a magnificent 4-point mule deer buck stepped cautiously into the open, its head raised as it tested the air for any sign of danger. Michael felt his heartbeat quicken, but he kept his breathing steady, just as his father had taught him. The deer took another step forward, and then another, gradually moving into an ideal position. Michael adjusted his aim, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report shattered the morning silence, echoing through the trees. The buck leapt at the sound, but the bullet had already found its mark, striking just behind the shoulder. The deer staggered, took 3 faltering steps, and collapsed onto the forest floor. "Got him," Michael murmured with quiet satisfaction, lowering his rifle. He waited a full 5 minutes, as was his practice, to ensure the deer was truly down before approaching. Then he carefully rose from his position, stretching to relieve the stiffness in his legs, and made his way toward his prize. The buck was larger than he'd initially estimated, probably weighing close to 200 pounds, a respectable harvest that would provide plenty of venison for both his family and Bobby's. Michael set his rifle aside and knelt beside the fallen deer, feeling the customary mixture of pride and solemnity that always accompanied a successful hunt. He reached out to touch the animal's flank, still warm, and offered a silent word of thanks, a personal ritual that acknowledged the taking of a life to sustain his own. He was reaching for his hunting knife to begin field dressing the deer when a sound from the trees behind him caused the hairs on the back of his neck to stand up. It wasn't the crack of a twig or the rustle of leaves, sounds that might indicate another hunter or a smaller animal passing through, but a deep, huffing grunt that was unmistakable to anyone who had spent time in bear country. Michael froze, his hand still on the hilt of his knife. Slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements, he turned his head to look over his shoulder. At first he saw nothing among the shadows of the pines, but then a large form detached itself from the darkness beneath the trees. A black bear, its coat gleaming in the early morning light, stood less than 30 yards away, its broad head raised as it scented the air. Black bears were common throughout the Salmon Chalice, generally less aggressive than their grizzly cousins, but still commanding respect. This one was on the larger side for a black bear, probably a male, and Michael estimated it weighed at least 300 pounds. Its small eyes were fixed on Michael, or more accurately, on the deer carcass beside him. Michael's mind raced through the bear safety protocols he knew by heart. Make yourself look bigger. Don't run. Back away slowly. But he was caught in the worst possible situation, between a predator and a potential meal. The smell of the deer's blood had likely drawn the bear to this spot, and Michael knew that fresh kill sites were among the most dangerous places to encounter bears in the wild. "Hey, bear!" Michael called out, keeping his voice calm but firm, as he slowly rose to his feet, making himself appear larger. "Hey, bear, go on now." He carefully reached for his rifle, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The bear huffed again, dropping onto all fours and taking a step forward, its nose working to catch the scent of the deer. Michael could see the powerful muscles shifting beneath its thick coat, the massive paws ending in curved claws that could disembowel a man with a single swipe. Despite its bulk, there was nothing clumsy about the bear's movements. It advanced with the fluid grace of an apex predator. "Back off," Michael said more forcefully, slinging his rifle and positioning it in front of him, though he kept the barrel pointed slightly away from the bear. He took a step back, putting more distance between himself and the deer. If the bear was only interested in the kill, maybe it would be satisfied with claiming the carcass. Michael was willing to sacrifice his hard-earned venison if it meant avoiding a confrontation. For a moment it seemed like that might be the case. The bear continued its approach, but its attention appeared focused on the deer rather than Michael. It was less than 20 yards away now, close enough that Michael could see the gleam of saliva at the corners of its mouth and catch its musky animal scent. He took another step back, and another, keeping his eyes on the bear but beginning to believe he might be able to withdraw without incident. Then the situation changed in an instant. Whether triggered by Michael's movement or some shift in the wind carrying his scent more strongly to the bear, the animal suddenly raised its head and fixed its gaze directly on Michael. It rose onto its hind legs, standing nearly 6 feet tall, and let out a deep rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the clearing. "Whoa, bear," Michael said, his voice steady despite the fear that surged through him. "Easy now." The key. Bear dropped back to all fours and, in a movement so swift it seemed impossible for a creature of its size, charged. In that moment, time seemed to slow for Michael. He could see the bear's powerful shoulders bunching as it launched itself forward, its mouth open to reveal yellowed fangs. He could see individual pine needles on the forest floor being kicked up by the bear's paws. He could hear his own heartbeat, thundering in his ears like a drum. Instinct took over. Michael raised his rifle knowing he had only seconds to act. He fired a warning shot into the air, hoping the sound would be enough to deter the charging bear. But whether driven by hunger, territorial aggression, or the simple predatory instinct to eliminate a perceived threat, the bear continued its headlong rush toward him. With no time to chambering another round, Michael used the only tool he had left, the rifle itself. As the bear closed the final few yards between them, he swung the weapon like a club, connecting solidly with the side of the animal's head. The impact was jarring, sending shockwaves up Michael's arms, but it only seemed to enrage the bear. Further, with a roar that shook the clearing, the bear reared up and struck out with a massive paw, catching Michael across the chest and sending him sprawling backward. The blow knocked the wind from Michael's lungs and sent the rifle flying from his hands. He hit the ground hard, his head snapping back to strike a rock, leaving him momentarily dazed. Through the fog of pain and disorientation, he was dimly aware of the bear advancing on him, its powerful form blocking out the morning sun. In desperation, Michael scrambled backward, his hands clawing at the forest floor as he tried to put distance between himself and the enraged bear. His fingers closed around a fallen branch, not much more than a thick stick, but he grasped it anyway, holding it out before him in a futile gesture of defense. The bear swiped again, its claws raking across Michael's left arm, shredding the sleeve of his hunting jacket and the flesh beneath. Pain exploded through him, hot and immediate, drawing a strangled cry from his throat. He kicked out, his boot connecting with the bear's chest, but it was like kicking a brick wall. The animal barely seemed to notice, pressing its attack with single-minded determination. Michael's world narrowed to a desperate struggle for survival. He struck at the bear with his makeshift club, aiming for the sensitive nose and eyes, fighting with the frantic energy of a man who knows his life hangs in the balance. But the bear was too strong, too powerful, its wild fury overwhelming Michael's desperate defense. Another blow from the bear's paw caught him on the side of the head, sending him spinning into semi-consciousness. He was vaguely aware of the bear's hot breath on his face, the weight of its massive body pinning him to the ground, the sharp pain as its teeth closed on his shoulder. "This is how I die," he thought with strange clarity, torn apart in the wilderness by a force of nature as old as the mountains themselves. Then, cutting through the fog of pain and fear, came the sharp crack of a rifle shot. The bear recoiled, releasing its grip on Michael's shoulder as it swung its head toward the new threat. Another shot rang out, and another, the reports echoing through the trees like thunderclaps. The bear backed away, huffing and growling, blood matting the fur on its right flank, where at least one bullet had found its mark. For a moment it seemed poised to charge again, its small eyes burning with primal rage. Then, as suddenly as the attack had begun, the bear turned and crashed away into the underbrush, leaving only trampled vegetation and spatters of blood to mark its passage. "Michael! Jesus Christ, Michael!" The voice seemed to come from a great distance, though part of Michael's mind recognized it as Bobby's. He tried to respond, but could only manage a feeble groan. His body felt strangely disconnected, floating in a sea of pain that threatened to pull him under completely. Bobby's face appeared above him, pale with shock, his usual good-humored expression replaced by wide-eyed fear. "Don't move, buddy. Don't try to move. I'm going to get you help." Michael wanted to tell Bobby that he was fine, that they could still salvage the hunting trip, but the words wouldn't form. He was cold, he realized dimly, despite the morning sun that now streamed. Fully into the clearing, cold and tired, so very tired. It would be easy to close his eyes, to slip away into the darkness that pressed at the edges of his vision. "Stay with me, Michael." Bobby's voice was urgent, almost angry. "Don't you dare check out on me. We've got too many hunts ahead of us." With trembling hands, Bobby was doing something to Michael's arm, wrapping it tightly with what looked like strips torn from his own shirt. The fabric quickly bloomed with red, but Bobby kept working, his movements becoming more assured as the initial shock gave way to focused action. "I'm going to get the first aid kit from my pack," Bobby said, his voice steadier now. Then I'm going to splint this arm. I think it's broken. And we're getting you the hell out of here. The truck's only about 3 miles back. You just hang tight." Michael tried to nod, but even that small movement sent waves of pain shooting through his skull. He watched through half-lidded eyes as Bobby retrieved his pack from where he'd dropped it at the edge of the clearing, digging through it to produce a compact first aid kit. The sun had risen higher in the sky, burning away the morning mist and illuminating the scene of devastation. The deer carcass lying forgotten, his scattered gear, the patches of ground torn up by the struggle, and the alarming amount of blood. His blood soaking into the forest floor. "You're lucky I heard that first shot," Bobby was saying as he returned, clearly talking to keep both of them calm. "I was up on the ridge, hadn't seen a damn thing all morning. Figured I'd give it another hour before heading back to camp. Then I heard your rifle and started making my way down, thinking maybe you'd had better luck. That's when I heard the bear." Bobby worked as he talked, cleaning the worst of Michael's wounds with antiseptic wipes that stung like fire, then applying pressure bandages from the kit. "Should have brought more supplies," he muttered. "Never thought we'd need a trauma kit out here." Michael tried again to speak, managing this time to form words despite the pain that seemed to radiate from every part of his body. "The bear," he croaked, his voice barely audible. Is it?" "I winged it," Bobby replied, understanding the question. "Don't think I hit anything vital. It ran off into the trees over there." He nodded toward the eastern edge of the clearing. "Don't worry about the damn bear now. We need to focus on getting you stable enough to move." Using 2 straight branches and the remaining bandages from the first aid kit, Bobby fashioned a crude splint for Michael's left arm, which was clearly broken. The pain of the setting was almost enough to send Michael back into unconsciousness, but he clung to awareness, focusing on Bobby's voice, which continued its steady stream of reassurance and instruction. "I'm going to help you sit up now," Bobby said, his hands gentle but firm as he supported Michael's shoulders. "Then we'll see about standing. It's going to hurt like hell, but we need to get moving. I don't think that bear's coming back, but I'm not betting your life on it." The change in position sent the world spinning around Michael, and for a moment he was sure he would vomit. He closed his eyes, waiting for the vertigo to pass, concentrating on the simple act of breathing through the pain. When he opened them again, the clearing had steadied somewhat, though the edges of his vision still pulsed with each heartbeat. With Bobby's support, Michael managed to get to his feet, swaying like a man on the deck of a ship in high seas. His left arm was immobilized by the splint, but his right shoulder, where the bear had bitten him, radiated pain with each movement. His head throbbed from the blow he'd taken, and his chest felt tight where the bear's claws had raked across it, the wounds burning beneath the bandages Bobby had applied. "My rifle," Michael said, looking around the clearing. "Leave it," Bobby replied firmly. "We can come back for it later." Michael wanted to protest. The Remington had been his father's, one of the few things he had left of the man who had taught him to hunt, to respect the wilderness, to move through these mountains with confidence and humility. But he knew Bobby was right. Their priority now was getting to safety, getting medical attention for injuries that were far beyond the capabilities of a wilderness first aid kit. With Bobby bearing most of his weight, Michael took a halting step, then another. His legs felt weak, rubbery, but they held him. The first few yards were the hardest, each step sending fresh waves of pain through his battered body. But gradually he found a rhythm, a way of moving that minimized the worst of the agony. The journey back to where they'd parked Bobby's truck was a nightmare that seemed to stretch into eternity. What would normally have been an hour's hike took more than 3, with frequent stops when Michael's strength gave out or the pain became too intense to continue. Bobby remained a steadfast presence at his side, alternately supporting him physically and encouraging him verbally, his usual joking manner replaced by a determined focus that Michael had rarely seen in his friend. "Just over this ridge," Bobby said as they paused for what felt like the 100th time, Michael leaning heavily against a tree trunk as he fought to catch his breath. "Then it's a straight shot down to the logging road where we left the truck. You're doing great, Michael. Just a little further." Michael nodded mutely, too exhausted for words. The initial shock had worn off during their arduous journey, leaving him in a state of hyper-awareness of his injuries. His left arm throbbed relentlessly beneath the splint, and he could feel the warmth of fresh blood seeping through the bandages on his shoulder and chest. His head pounded with each heartbeat, and he suspected he had a concussion from the blow he'd taken. But worse than the physical pain was the creeping coldness that seemed to be spreading through his body, a coldness he recognized from his wilderness first aid training as a sign of progressive shock. With a supreme effort, Michael pushed himself away from the tree and signaled his readiness to continue, one foot in front of the other. Just keep moving. The mantra repeated in his mind, becoming a rhythm that helped him focus through the fog of pain and exhaustion. They crested the ridge, and there below them, just as Bobby had promised, was the narrow logging road where they'd left the truck the previous day. It seemed impossibly far away, though Michael knew it couldn't be more than a quarter mile. The sight of it, this tangible connection to civilization, to safety, gave him a fresh surge of determination. The descent was treacherous, the steep slope covered in loose scree that shifted underfoot. Twice Michael stumbled, and only Bobby's quick reactions prevented him from falling. By the time they reached level ground, both men were breathing hard, their faces streaked with sweat despite the cool October air. "There she is," Bobby said, nodding toward his Ford F-150, which sat where they had left it at a small pullout, beside the logging road. "Almost home free, buddy." The last 100 yards were the easiest physically but the hardest mentally, as Michael's body, recognizing the proximity of safety, began to surrender to the trauma it had endured. His vision narrowed to a tunnel, his hearing reduced to a dull roaring like the sound of a distant river. Only Bobby's constant encouragement and physical support kept him moving forward, one agonizing step at a time. When they finally reached the truck, it took both of them to get Michael into the passenger seat. He slumped against the door as Bobby secured the seatbelt around him, too weak even to assist in the simple task. Through the haze of pain and exhaustion, he was dimly aware of Bobby retrieving a blanket from behind the seat and tucking it around him, then placing a bottle of water in his lap with instructions to drink if he could. "Hang on, Michael," Bobby said as he started the engine, the truck's familiar rumble oddly comforting in the midst of the nightmare this day had become. "Nearest hospital is in Salmon. About an hour's drive. We'll have you there in no time." Michael nodded faintly, his eyes already closing as the warmth of the truck's heater began to thaw the bone-deep chill that had settled into him. He was safe now, or as safe as he could be under the circumstances. Bobby would get him to help. All he had to do was hold on. The journey to Salmon passed in a blur of semi-consciousness for Michael, the truck's movement over the rough logging road sending spikes of pain through his battered body with each bump and jolt. He drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes hearing Bobby talking to him, sometimes hearing nothing but the roar of blood in his ears. At some point, Bobby had managed to get cell service and called ahead to the hospital, his voice tense as he explained the situation and their estimated time of arrival. Steel Memorial Hospital came into view just as Michael felt himself slipping toward unconsciousness again. It was a modest facility, as befitted a town of Salmon's size, but at that moment it looked more welcoming than the finest hotel Michael had ever seen. Bobby pulled up directly to the emergency entrance where, true to his word over the phone, a team was waiting with a gurney. The transfer from truck to gurney was a fresh agony, drawing a groan from Michael's throat despite his best efforts to remain stoic. Then he was being wheeled rapidly through automatic doors, the fluorescent lights of the emergency department harsh after the filtered sunlight of the forest. Medical personnel surrounded him, their voices a cacophony of questions and observations that washed over him without making much impression. "Bear attack in the Salmon Chalice," Bobby was explaining to someone, "about 4 hours ago. His left arm is definitely broken, and he's got lacerations on his chest, shoulder, and head. I think he's in shock. BP's 90-60 and dropping," a female voice announced. "Heart rate 120, thready. O2 sat 92%. Let's get 2 large-bore IVs started. And push a liter of saline wide open." "Sir, can you hear me?" Another voice close to Michael's ear. "Sir, I need you to stay with us. Can you tell me your name?" "Michael," he managed to whisper. "Michael Davis." "Good, Michael. You're at Steel Memorial Hospital in Salmon. We're going to take care of you. Can you tell me what day it is?" He tried to focus, to push back the darkness that hovered at the edges of his vision. "Tuesday, October 18th. "That's right, it's Tuesday. You're doing great. So we're going to give you something for the pain now, and then we need to get some images of that arm and check the rest of your injuries." A sharp sting in his right arm heralded the insertion of an IV, quickly followed by the cool rush of fluid entering his vein. Almost immediately, another sensation followed, a spreading warmth that seemed to soften the edges of his pain, making it more distant, more manageable. "Morphine," he realized dimly. "They've given me morphine." The next few hours passed in a kaleidoscope of medical procedures. X-rays confirmed what both Michael and Bobby had suspected. His left radius and ulna were fractured, requiring surgical repair. CT scans showed no sign of internal bleeding, but did reveal a moderate concussion. The lacerations on his chest, shoulder and arm required extensive cleaning and stitching. with the deepest wounds on his shoulder needing layered closure to repair damaged muscle tissue. Throughout it all, the medical team worked with the efficient precision of those accustomed to treating wilderness injuries, a common occurrence in this part of Idaho. It was early evening by the time Michael was settled in a hospital room, his arm immobilized in a temporary cast, until the orthopedic surgeon could perform the necessary procedure the following morning. Bobby had remained at the hospital the entire time, alternating between sitting with Michael when allowed and pacing the waiting room when not. Now he sat in a chair beside Michael's bed, his usually animated face drawn with fatigue and concern. "They say, you're going to be fine," Bobby said, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Broken arm, 47 stitches total, and a concussion that'll give you one hell of a headache for a few days. But considering what happened, you got off pretty damn lucky." Michael, somewhat more lucid now thanks to the IV fluids and pain medication, managed a weak smile in return. "Doesn't feel very lucky at the moment," he murmured, his voice raspy from the oxygen mask he'd worn earlier. "Trust me, it could have been a lot worse." Bobby's expression grew serious. "That bear meant business, Michael. If I'd been just a few minutes later getting there," he didn't need to finish the thought. Both men knew that bear attacks, while relatively rare, were often fatal when they did occur. Michael had indeed been lucky. Lucky that Bobby had heard the shot, lucky that his friend had arrived when he did, lucky that the bear had retreated rather than pressing its attack despite its injury. "Thank you," Michael said, simply, the inadequacy of the words measuring against the immensity of what Bobby had done for him. "I owe you one. You'd have done the same for me," Bobby replied with a dismissive wave. "That's what friends are for, right? Saving each other from murderous wildlife." The attempted joke fell flat, both men still too close to the trauma of the morning's events to find humor in them. Bobby cleared his throat awkwardly. "The doctor said a ranger from the Forest Service wants to talk to you. I told them tomorrow would be better after you've had some rest." Michael nodded, grateful for Bobby's protectiveness, but also understanding the necessity of the interview. Bear attacks were serious incidents that required documentation and potentially management action if the animal involved posed an ongoing threat to humans. "I should call Karen," Michael said, thinking of his wife of 15 years who would be at home in Boise with their teenage children, blissfully unaware of how close she had come to becoming a widow that day. "She'll be worried when we don't check in tonight." "Already taken care of," Bobby assured him. "I called her while you were getting those stitches. She's on her way here now, should arrive sometime tomorrow morning." Michael closed his eyes briefly, imagining Karen's reaction to the news. She had always been supportive of his hunting trips, understanding that they represented more than just the pursuit of game. They were a connection to his father, to the traditions of his youth, to a sense of self-reliance that was increasingly rare in the modern world. But she had also always harbored a quiet fear of the potential dangers, a fear she rarely expressed, but that Michael knew existed nonetheless. Now that fear had been realized, and he wasn't sure how either of them would process that reality. "You should get some rest," Bobby said, rising from his chair with obvious reluctance. "I'm going to find a motel for the night, but I'll be back first thing in the morning. Is there anything you need before I go?" Michael shook his head, then immediately regretted the movement as pain lanced through his skull despite the medication. "I'm fine," he said, the lie transparent to both of them. "Get some sleep, and Bobby, thanks again for everything." Bobby paused at the door, looking back at his friend with an expression that mixed concern, relief, and something deeper. The unspoken bond between two men who had shared something profound, something that would forever alter the nature of their relationship. Then he was gone, leaving Michael alone with the steady beep of the heart monitor and the muted sounds of the hospital at night. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and haunted by vivid dreams. In them, Michael relived the attack again and again, each time with subtle variations. Sometimes the bear was larger, more monstrous. Sometimes Bobby didn't arrive in time. Sometimes Michael found himself running through an endless forest, the sound of the bear's breathing close behind him no matter how fast he fled. He woke several times, disoriented and in pain as the medication wore off, only to be soothed back to sleep by the night nurse, who came to check his vitals and administer another dose. Morning arrived with the same sense of unreality that had characterized the previous day. Michael opened his eyes to find sunlight streaming through the window of his hospital room, illuminating a vase of flowers that hadn't been there the night before. For a moment, he couldn't reconcile his surroundings with his last clear memory of being in the forest, and panic surged through him before the events of the previous day reassembled themselves in his mind. "Good morning, Mr. Davis." A nurse he hadn't seen before entered the room, checking the monitors beside his bed with practiced efficiency. "How are we feeling today?" "Like I got hit by a truck," Michael replied. Honestly, the pain in his arm and shoulder a dull throb beneath the blanket of medication, or mauled by a bear, I guess. The nurse, her name tag read Jessica, smiled sympathetically. "Dr. Patel will be in to see you soon. He's the orthopedic surgeon who'll be repairing your arm later today, and you have some visitors waiting whenever you feel up to seeing them." "Visitors?" Michael asked, confusion momentarily clouding his thoughts. "Your wife arrived about an hour ago," Jessica explained, "and your friend, Mr. Walsh, I believe, is with her. There's also a representative from the Forest Service who would like to speak with you when you're feeling stronger." Karen. The thought of seeing his wife brought a rush of emotion that caught Michael by surprise. He suddenly wanted nothing more than to hold her, to reassure himself that the world still contained normal things like her smile and the scent of her hair, that life extended beyond the nightmare of the bear attack and its aftermath. "I'd like to see my wife," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. "And Bobby. The Forest Service can wait a bit longer." Jessica nodded and disappeared, returning moments later with Karen and Bobby in tow. Karen's face was pale with worry, her usually neat brown hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail, dark circles under her eyes, suggesting she had driven through the night to reach him. She rushed to the bedside, her hand finding his with desperate gentleness. "Michael," she breathed, her voice catching. "Oh my God, Michael." "Hey," he said softly, squeezing her hand with his uninjured one. "I'm okay, really. It looks worse than it is." It was a lie, of course. If anything, he suspected it was actually worse than it looked, at least in terms of the long-term recovery he faced, but it was the kind of lie that served a purpose, that helped both of them navigate the shock of the situation. "Bobby told me what happened," Karen said, her free hand hovering near his face as if afraid to touch him, to cause more pain. "He said you were the bear. Bobby saved my life," Michael said simply, glancing over Karen's shoulder to where his friend stood awkwardly by the door, clearly uncomfortable with the praise but unable to deny the truth of it. "I just did what needed doing," Bobby mumbled, shuffling his feet. "Any hunter would have done the same." Karen turned to him, her expression fierce despite the tears that threatened to spill from her eyes. "Thank you," she said, the words carrying the weight of everything she couldn't articulate. "Thank you for bringing him back to us." Bobby nodded, acceptance of her gratitude mingling with embarrassment at being the focus of such raw emotion. "I'm just glad I was close enough to help," he said, "and that Michael's tough as old boots." Most men would have given up somewhere between the clearing and the truck. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Patel, a compact man with kind eyes and an air of quiet competence. He introduced himself, then proceeded to explain the surgical procedure that would be necessary to repair Michael's broken arm. "The fractures are relatively clean," he said, showing them the X-ray images on a tablet. "We'll stabilize both bones with plates and screws. The surgery itself should take about 2 hours, and we'll have you under general anesthesia for the duration. Recovery will involve several weeks in a cast, followed by physical therapy to regain full strength and range of motion. But I don't anticipate any long-term loss of function, provided you follow the rehabilitation protocol diligently." Michael nodded, trying to absorb the information through the fog of pain medication and lingering shock. The prospect of surgery was daunting, but less so than the alternative of permanent disability. He had always been an active man, priding himself on his physical capabilities, whether in his work as a construction contractor or in his pursuits in the outdoors. The thought of losing that part of his identity was more frightening in some ways than the bear attack itself had been. "And the other injuries?" Karen asked, her practical nature asserting itself now that the initial emotional response had passed. "His shoulder, his head. The lacerations are severe, but not life-threatening," Dr. Patel replied. "They've been thoroughly cleaned and stitched, and we've started him on antibiotics to prevent infection. Always a concern with animal bites and scratches. The concussion is mild to moderate. We'll continue to monitor for any signs of intracranial pressure, but the CT scan was reassuring. Overall, Mr. Davis was quite fortunate. Bear attacks often result in much more extensive trauma." There was that word again, fortunate. Michael wondered if he would ever be able to think of himself that way again, or if the memory of those terrifying moments when he was certain he was about to die would forever overshadow any sense of luck or blessing. Dr. Patel departed after scheduling the surgery for early afternoon, leaving Michael once again with Karen and Bobby. The three of them talked quietly for a while. The conversation carefully steered away from the details of the attack itself, focusing instead on practical matters. how long Michael might be hospitalized, arrangements for the children back in Boise, the logistics of the recovery period that lay ahead. Eventually, a nurse arrived to inform them that the Forest Service ranger was still waiting to speak with Michael and that it might be best to conduct the interview before the pre-surgical preparations began. Karen and Bobby reluctantly agreed to step out, promising to return once the official business was concluded. The ranger who entered the room was not what Michael had expected. Based on previous encounters during his years of hunting in the national forests of Idaho, he had anticipated a grizzled older man, weathered by years of outdoor work. Instead, Ranger Sarah Collins was a woman in her early 30s, with short-cropped blonde hair and the lean, muscular build of someone who spent most of her working hours on mountain trails rather than behind a desk. "Mr. Davis," she said, approaching the bed with a professional smile. "I'm Ranger Collins with the Salmon Chalice National Forest. I understand you've had a pretty rough experience. How are you feeling?" "I've been better," Michael replied, attempting to match her matter-of-fact tone. "But I've been told I was lucky, all things considered." She nodded, pulling up the chair that Karen had vacated and retrieving a tablet from her backpack. "I need to get some information from you about the incident, if you're up to answering a few questions. It helps us track bear activity and behavior in the forest and determines whether any management action might be necessary." "Management action," Michael repeated, understanding the euphemism. "You mean whether you need to track down and kill the bear?" Ranger Collins's expression remained neutral. "In some cases, yes, that becomes necessary, particularly if a bear shows predatory behavior toward humans or returns repeatedly to areas of human activity. But the decision isn't made lightly, and it's based on multiple factors, including the details of encounters like yours." She began a series of questions, systematically working through the events of the previous morning. Where exactly had the encounter occurred? Michael described the location as best he could, referencing landmarks and estimated distances from the trailhead where they had parked. What time of day? Early morning, just after daybreak. Had he observed the bear before it charged? Yes, it had emerged from the tree line after he'd shot the deer. Had he taken any action that might have provoked the bear? Michael hesitated at this, considering. "I tried to scare it off," he admitted. "Made myself look bigger, spoke firmly, fired a warning shot, but I was between it and the deer carcass. I'm guessing it saw me as competition for the kill, or maybe as a threat to its food source." Ranger Collins nodded, making notes on her tablet. "That's consistent with defensive behavior, rather than predatory. A predatory attack usually involves stalking and is often silent. The fact that the bear was vocal, huffing and growling, you said, suggests it was responding to a perceived threat rather than actively hunting you." She continued with her questions. Had Michael been carrying bear spray? No, it had been in his backpack, which he'd left at his original position before approaching the deer. Had he been hunting alone? No, Bobby had been in the same general area, but not within immediate sight or sound until the attack was already underway. Had the bear been marked or tagged in any way? Not that he had noticed, though he acknowledged that in the stress of the moment he might have missed such details. "One last question," Ranger Collins said, her expression serious. "Your friend Mr. Walsh mentioned that he shot at the bear as it was attacking you. Do you know if he hit it, and if so, where?" Michael closed his eyes briefly, trying to recall the chaotic moments of the attack. "I think so," he said slowly. "The bear flinched when the shots were fired, and Bobby said later that he thought he'd winged it. It was bleeding from the right side, the flank, I think, when it ran off." Ranger Collins made a final note, then set her tablet aside. "Thank you, Mr. Davis. This information is very helpful. Based on what you've told me and the location of the incident, I believe the bear in question was likely a mature male black bear that we've been tracking in that area for several seasons. He's known to be bold around humans but hasn't shown predatory behavior before this. The fact that a food source, the deer, was involved suggests this was a resource defensing incident rather than a predatory one." "What happens now?" Michael asked, unsure whether he wanted to hear that the bear would be left alone or that it would be removed from the forest permanently. "We'll increase patrols in that area for the next few weeks, post warnings at trailheads, and try to locate the bear to assess its condition. If it was wounded, as you suggest, it might become more dangerous due to decreased mobility or ability to hunt natural prey. If we can confirm it's the same bear and find evidence of continued aggressive behavior, it might need to be relocated or euthanized, but those decisions will be made based on ongoing observation, not solely on this one incident." She stood, gathering her things. "I'm sorry this happened to you, Mr. Davis. Despite our best efforts at education and prevention, the wilderness remains wild, with all the beauty and danger that entails. I wish you a speedy recovery." After Ranger Collins departed, Michael was left alone with his thoughts for a short time before the pre-surgical preparations began. The interview had stirred up vivid memories of the attack, images he had been trying to keep at bay. The bear's open mouth as it charged, the gleam of its eyes, the incredible strength he had felt in those massive paws. He found himself trembling slightly, a delayed reaction to the trauma that even the hospital's strong painkillers couldn't entirely suppress. A nurse arrived to begin preparing him for surgery, checking his vitals one last time, and explaining the procedure for the anesthesia. Karen and Bobby were allowed a brief visit before he was wheeled to the operating room, their encouraging words washing over him without really penetrating the anxiety that had begun to build. It wasn't the surgery itself that frightened him, it was the growing awareness of how profoundly his life had been altered in those few violent moments in the forest, and the uncertainty of what that might mean for his future. The anesthesiologist's introduction was the last thing Michael remembered before waking in the recovery room. Groggy and disoriented, his left arm now encased in a proper cast and immobilized against his body. The surgeon assured him that the procedure had gone well, that the bones had been successfully realigned and secured, and that with proper care and rehabilitation, he could expect a complete recovery. The next 2 days passed in a haze of medication, medical checks and brief visits from Karen, who had taken a room at the same motel where Bobby was staying. Bobby himself appeared frequently, sometimes bringing small gifts, magazines, a paperback thriller, snacks that supplemented the bland hospital food. Neither of them pressed Michael to talk about the attack, seemingly content to focus on practical matters and light conversation, but he could sense their concern in the way they watched him, in their careful avoidance of any topic that might trigger difficult memories. On the 3rd day after the surgery, Dr. Patel declared Michael fit for discharge, provided he returned in 2 weeks for a follow-up examination. The doctor provided detailed instructions for wound care, medication management, and the limitations Michael would need to observe while his injuries healed. "The most important thing now is to prevent infection," Dr. Patel emphasized, particularly regarding the wounds on Michael's shoulder and chest. "Animal bites are notoriously prone to bacterial contamination. Continue the oral antibiotics as prescribed, keep the wounds clean and dressed according to the instructions we've provided, and watch for any signs of increased redness, swelling, or drainage. If you notice any of those, or if you develop a fever, contact your primary care physician in Boise immediately." Michael nodded, trying to absorb all the information, despite the fatigue that seemed to have settled permanently into his bones. The prospect of the 3-hour drive back to Boise was daunting, but the desire to be home, to sleep in his own bed, to see his children, Ryan, 16, and Emily, 14, outweighed his physical discomfort. "What about work?" he asked, thinking of the construction projects he had ongoing through his small contracting business. "How long before I can get back to normal activities?" Dr. Patel's expression was sympathetic, but firm. "You're looking at a minimum of 6 to 8 weeks before the cast comes off, Mr. Davis. After that, physical therapy will be necessary to rebuild strength and range of motion in the arm. As for returning to work, it depends on the nature of your job. Office tasks could be resumed relatively soon, with accommodations for the cast. Heavy physical labor would need to wait until you've completed rehabilitation, which could be several months." The reality of the situation hit Michael with fresh force. His business relied heavily on his personal involvement in projects, not just for management but for much of the skilled labor. He had a small crew of regular employees, but none with the experience to take over his role entirely. The financial implications of such a prolonged absence were concerning, to say the least. "We'll figure it out," Karen said, sensing his worry. "One step at a time, okay? Let's just focus on getting you home for now." The discharge process was completed by mid-morning, and Michael found himself being wheeled out of the hospital to Bobby's truck, which waited at the entrance with Karen in the passenger seat. The brief journey from wheelchair to vehicle was an exercise in pain management, every movement sending fresh waves of discomfort through his injured body, despite the medication he'd been given before leaving. Once settled in the back seat, propped up with pillows Bobby had thoughtfully acquired for the purpose, Michael found himself looking out at the town of Salmon with new eyes. The small Idaho community, which he had passed through many times on his way to hunting trips in the surrounding wilderness, now held a significance it never had before. It was the place where his life had been saved, where strangers had worked with professional dedication to repair the damage inflicted by one of nature's most powerful predators. As Bobby navigated the truck out of the hospital parking lot and onto the highway that would eventually lead them back to Boise, Michael caught a glimpse of forested mountains rising in the distance, the same mountains where, just a few days earlier, he had faced his own mortality in the most primal way imaginable. The sight sent an involuntary shiver through him, a physical manifestation of the fear that still lingered beneath the surface of his conscious thoughts. "Cold?" Karen asked from the front seat, turning to check on him with concern evident in her expression. "A little," Michael lied, not wanting to burden her with the complexity of his emotional response. The air conditioning might be up too high. Bobby immediately adjusted the climate controls, and Karen passed back an extra blanket she'd brought along in anticipation of such a need. The small gesture of care brought an unexpected lump to Michael's throat, a reminder of the support system he was fortunate to have, something he had perhaps taken too much for granted before the attack. The journey home was punctuated by regular stops for medication, for careful walks to prevent blood clots, for meals at roadside diners where Michael picked at food he couldn't really taste, his appetite still diminished by pain and medication. Throughout it all, Karen and Bobby maintained a steady stream of conversation, clearly intended to keep his mind occupied with topics far removed from bears and broken bones. It was early evening by the time they reached the outskirts of Boise, the city lights blinking on as dusk settled over the Treasure Valley. Michael felt a surge of emotion as they turned onto his street. The familiar sight of his modest two-story home, with its well-tended front yard and basketball hoop over the garage door, representing a normalcy he had feared he might never experience again. The front door opened before Bobby had fully stopped the truck, and Ryan and Emily burst out, their faces a mixture of worry and relief. They had been staying with Karen's sister during their mother's absence, kept informed of the situation, but spared the worst details. Now they hovered uncertainly beside the vehicle as Bobby and Karen helped Michael out, clearly shocked by their father's appearance, despite having been prepared for it. "Dad," Emily said, her voice small, tears welling in her eyes as she took in the cast, the visible bandages, the bruises that had blossomed across his face. At 14, she was still very much a daddy's girl, prone to dramatics but with a genuine depth of feeling that sometimes surprised Michael. "Hey, sweetheart," he managed, forcing a smile that he hoped would reassure her. "I look worse than I feel, I promise." Ryan, at that awkward age where showing emotion was deemed uncool, maintained a more stoic expression, but Michael could see the concern in his eyes, so like his own. "Need any help getting inside?" the boy asked, his voice cracking slightly with the strain of suppressed feeling. "I think we've got it, but thanks," Michael replied, leaning heavily on Bobby as they made their way slowly up the front walk. "But you can grab my bag from the truck if you want." The simple request seemed to give Ryan purpose, a way to contribute, without having to directly confront the emotional aspects of the situation. He nodded and moved toward the truck, while Emily fell into step beside Karen, whispering questions that Michael couldn't quite hear but could easily imagine. Entering the house was like stepping into another world, one where bear attacks happened. To other people, where the most pressing concern might be what to make for dinner or whether homework had been completed. The familiar sense of home, the arrangement of furniture, the family photos on the walls, all of it remained exactly as it had been before Michael's world had been upended, creating a cognitive dissonance that was almost dizzying. With Bobby's help, Michael was settled in the recliner in the living room, his injured arm supported by pillows, a footstool positioned to elevate his legs. Karen busied herself getting his medication organized and preparing a light meal, while the children orbited around him, clearly wanting to ask questions, but uncertain how or where to begin. "It's okay," Michael said finally, breaking the awkward silence that had descended. "You can ask about it. I know you must be curious. Did it hurt?" Emily blurted immediately, then flushed with embarrassment at the obviousness of the question. "Yeah, it hurt," Michael admitted, keeping his tone conversational rather than dramatic. "But not as much as you might think, at least not during the attack itself. That's one of the strange things about serious injuries. Sometimes the body goes into a kind of shock that blocks the worst of the pain until later." "Bobby said you fought it off," Ryan said, a note of pride entering his voice despite his attempt at casual interest. "That's pretty badass, Dad." "Language?" Karen called from the kitchen, her automatic response drawing a brief smile from Michael. "I wouldn't say I fought it off exactly," he corrected gently. "I tried, but that bear was a lot stronger than me." Bobby's the one who saved the day with some well-placed shots that convinced the bear to find easier prey elsewhere. Bobby, who had been quietly arranging Michael's belongings nearby, looked up with a frown. "Give yourself some credit, Michael. Most men would have been done for the moment that bear made contact. You held your own long enough for me to get there. That takes serious guts." Michael shrugged his good shoulder, uncomfortable with the praise but recognizing that allowing Bobby to frame the event this way might be important for the children's peace of mind. If they believed their father had displayed courage and resilience in the face of danger, perhaps it would help mitigate their fear and worry. "What happened to the bear?" Emily asked, her concern extending even to the animal that had nearly killed her father. "Did they have to, you know?" She made a vague gesture that Michael interpreted as representing euthanasia. "No, as far as I know, it's still out there." "In the forest," he replied. "The ranger I spoke with at the hospital said they would monitor the situation, but unless the bear shows a pattern of aggression toward humans, they prefer to let nature take its course." "Are you going to go hunting again?" Ryan's question came with an edge of challenge, as if he was daring his father to admit fear, to show weakness by abandoning an activity that had been part of their family's tradition for generations. Michael hesitated, genuinely unsure of the answer. The thought of returning to the forest, of being in bear country again, sent a cold knot of anxiety into his stomach. But could he really give up hunting altogether? Would the fear eventually fade, allowing him to reclaim that part of his identity? "I don't know," he admitted finally, deciding that honesty was more important than maintaining some facade of fearlessness. "Right now, I'm just focused on healing. We'll see how I feel when the time comes." Ryan nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer, or at least willing to accept it for now. The conversation shifted to more mundane topics after that: school events, neighborhood gossip, the latest viral video that had captured the teenagers' attention. It was normality reasserting itself, the rhythm of family life continuing despite the disruption of the past few days. As the evening progressed, Michael found himself growing increasingly fatigued, the combination of the journey and the emotional strain of the homecoming taking its toll. Karen, ever attentive to his needs, noticed his drooping eyelids and quieter participation in the conversation. "I think it's time we let your father get some rest," she announced, beginning to gather the dishes from the light dinner they had, shared in the living room. "He's had a long day and those medications make him pretty drowsy." Bobby rose from his seat, stretching after hours of sitting. "I should be heading home anyway," he said. "Catherine's probably wondering if I've moved out permanently at this point." The joke referenced his own strained marital situation, but there was warmth in his voice when he spoke of his wife, suggesting that perhaps the events of the past few days had put his own problems into perspective. Michael struggled to his feet, waving away Karen's immediate move to assist him. "I'll walk you to the door," he said to Bobby. The simple act of seeing his friend out somehow important despite his physical discomfort. The few steps to the front door were manageable, though Michael moved with the cautious gait of someone newly acquainted with their own fragility. At the threshold, the two men faced each other, a moment of awkwardness descending, as neither seemed quite sure how to conclude this chapter of their shared experience. "I don't know how to thank you," Michael said finally, the words inadequate but heartfelt, not just for what happened in the forest, but for everything since, staying at the hospital, helping with the drive home, all of it. Bobby shook his head, dismissing the gratitude with characteristic modesty. "You'd have done the same. For me, that's what matters, right? Knowing we've got each other's backs when it counts." "Still," Michael insisted, "I owe you, my family owes you, if there's ever anything you need, anything at all. Just focus on getting better," Bobby replied, clapping Michael gently on his uninjured shoulder. "And maybe, when you're up for it, we can talk about next year's hunt. Different location maybe, somewhere with fewer bears." The suggestion hung in the air between them, both an acknowledgement of the trauma they had shared and an expression of hope that it would not define them permanently. Michael found himself nodding, not quite a commitment but a willingness to consider the possibility. "Yeah," he said, "maybe we could do that." After Bobby's departure, the remainder of the evening passed in a quiet domestic routine. Karen helped Michael upstairs to their bedroom, the journey more challenging than he had anticipated, requiring frequent pauses as waves of dizziness and pain washed over him. The medication he took before bed promised relief, but as he settled against the pillows propped up to accommodate his injuries, sleep seemed elusive despite his exhaustion. "Do you want to talk about it?" Karen asked softly, sliding into bed beside him with careful movements, mindful of jostling his injured arm. "Really talk about it, I mean, not the edited version you gave the kids." Michael stared up at the ceiling, considering the question. Since the attack, he had recounted the facts numerous times, to the medical team, to Ranger Collins, to his family in broad strokes, but had avoided delving into the emotional impact, the raw terror, the moments when he had been certain he was about to die. "I thought that was it," he said finally, his voice low in the darkened room. "When that bear had me pinned, when I felt its teeth, I was sure I was never going to see you or the kids again. And the strange thing is, I wasn't thinking about anything profound. No life flashing before my eyes, no great realizations, just regret. Regret that I wouldn't be there to see Ryan graduate, to walk Emily down the aisle someday. Regret that I wouldn't grow old with you." Karen's hand found his in the darkness, her grip warm and solid, anchoring him to the present, even as his mind revisited those terrifying moments. "But you're here," she whispered. "You made it." "This time," Michael replied, the words escaping before he could censor them. "But what if next time there's no Bobby nearby? What if it's not just a broken arm and some stitches, but something worse? I keep thinking about all the risks I've taken over the years, all the times I've gone into the backcountry alone or in bad weather, and how lucky I've been that nothing serious ever happened before now." Karen was silent for a long moment, her thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of his hand. "Are you saying you want to stop hunting?" she asked finally. "Because if that's what you need to do, I would understand. We all would." "I don't know what I'm saying," Michael admitted, frustration evident in his tone. "Hunting has always been, it's been a part of who I am. Something my father taught me, something I hope to teach our kids. The idea of giving it up feels like giving up a piece of myself, but at the same time the thought of going back out there, of being in bear country again." He let the sentence trail off, unable to articulate the complex tangle of emotions the prospect evoked. Fear, certainly, but also a sense of loss, of innocence shattered. The wilderness that had always been a source of solace and renewal now held a darker aspect, a reminder of human vulnerability in the face of nature's indifferent power. "You don't have to decide anything right now," Karen said gently. "You've got months of recovery ahead of you. Take that time to heal, not just your body but your mind too. And whatever you decide, we'll support you. That's what family does." Her words were comforting in their simplicity, offering acceptance without pressure, understanding without judgment. Michael felt some of the tension ease from his shoulders, the medication finally beginning to take effect, drawing him towards sleep. "Thank you," he murmured, his eyes growing heavy. "For everything, for being here, always," Karen replied, her voice the last thing he registered before drifting into a mercifully dreamless sleep. The days that followed settled into a pattern of gradual adjustment to his new limitations. Simple tasks that Michael had always taken for granted, dressing himself, preparing food, even personal grooming, now presented challenges that required adaptation and often assistance. The independence he had prized throughout his adult life was compromised, leaving him alternately frustrated and humbled by his reliance on others. Karen took 2 weeks of leave from her job as an elementary school administrator to help during the initial recovery period, coordinating with Michael's doctor appointments, managing his medications, and assisting with daily activities. The children stepped up as well, Ryan taking over the yard work and household maintenance tasks that had previously been Michael's domain, while Emily assumed additional responsibilities in the kitchen and with housekeeping. Michael's business partner Dave Simmons visited frequently, bringing updates on ongoing projects and assurances that things were under control. They had worked together for nearly a decade, building Davis and Simmons Construction into a respected local firm specializing in custom home renovations. Dave had always handled more of the administrative side of the business, while Michael focused on the hands-on aspects of the work, but now Dave was shouldering both roles, putting in long hours to ensure their clients remained satisfied and their employees paid. "Don't worry about anything on the work front," Dave insisted during one such visit about a week after Michael's return home. "Jenkins and Martinez are handling that kitchen remodel on Harrison Avenue, and I've got Peterson supervising the deck project out in Eagle. Everything's on schedule, more or less." "I appreciate it," Michael said, genuinely grateful but still uncomfortable with his enforced idleness. "But I should be able to at least come by the office, look over some plans, make some calls. I'm not completely incapacitated." Dave exchanged a glance with Karen, who stood in the doorway with a pot of coffee. "Actually," he said carefully, "the doctor mentioned you should be focusing on rest for at least another week or two. No work, stress, remember? Besides, I've got things covered. Just concentrate on getting better. The business will still be there when you're ready to come back." Michael recognized the coordinated effort to keep him from pushing himself too soon, and while part of him resented being managed, He couldn't deny the logic of it. His energy levels remained frustratingly low, with even minor exertions leaving him drained. The pain in his arm and shoulder, while controlled by medication, was a constant presence, flaring into sharp intensity whenever he moved incautiously. And beneath the physical discomfort lurked other symptoms: nightmares that left him gasping awake in the darkness, sudden spikes of anxiety when he heard unexpected noises, moments of disorientation when the memory of the attack would superimpose itself on his current surroundings with vivid intensity. These psychological effects worried him more than the physical injuries, though he tried to keep their extent hidden from Karen and the children. During his follow-up appointment with his primary care physician in Boise, however, Dr. Heller noticed the signs without prompting. "Have you been experiencing flashbacks?" she asked after examining his healing wounds and checking the cast for any issues. Nightmares, heightened startle response, intrusive thoughts about the attack. Michael hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Some," he admitted. "Is that normal?" "Absolutely," Dr. Heller assured him. "What you experienced was a significant trauma. It would be unusual if you didn't have some psychological reaction to it. These symptoms are consistent with acute stress disorder, which often develops after life-threatening experiences. The good news is that for most people, they gradually diminish over time without specific intervention." "And if they don't?" Michael asked, voicing the fear that had begun to grow as the nightmares persisted and the anxiety attacks showed no sign of abating. "Then we might be looking at post-traumatic stress disorder, which would require more focused treatment," Dr. Heller replied frankly. "But let's not get ahead of ourselves. It's only been 2 weeks since the attack. Give yourself time to process the experience. I can recommend some techniques that might help in the meantime. Mindfulness exercises, controlled breathing for anxiety attacks, a journaling practice to externalize your thoughts about what happened. And if things aren't improving after another few weeks, or if they're getting worse, we can discuss more formal therapeutic options." Michael left the appointment with a prescription for a mild anti-anxiety medication to be used as needed and a handout detailing the suggested coping techniques. He didn't mention either to Karen immediately, tucking the prescription into his wallet and the handout into his pocket, unsure why he felt the need to keep this aspect of his recovery private, but unwilling to examine the impulse too closely. That evening, after Karen and the children had gone to bed, Michael found himself sitting alone in the darkened living room, unable to sleep despite his physical exhaustion. The house creaked and settled around him, ordinary noises that had never bothered him before but now set his nerves on edge, triggering a hypervigilance that exhausted him, yet refused to relent. On impulse, he reached for his laptop, opening a new document with no clear intention, beyond the need to externalize the thoughts that circled endlessly in his mind. For a long moment, he stared at the blank screen, the cursor blinking expectantly. Then, slowly at first but with increasing fluency, he began to type. "I don't know if this is what Dr. Heller meant by journaling, but here goes. 2 weeks ago, I was attacked by a black bear in the Salmon Chalice National Forest. That's the simple version, the one I give when people ask what happened. The reality was messier. What I remember most vividly is the smell. Everyone talks about the fear, the pain, the understanding that you might be about to die. But no one mentions the smell of a wild animal up close, the rank musk of its fur, the hot metallic scent of its breath. It's primal, that smell. It bypasses all the civilized parts of your brain and goes straight to something ancient, something that remembers what it was like when humans weren't at the top of the food chain. I remember thinking, as the bear had me pinned, that this was wrong somehow. Not morally wrong, but wrong in the order of things. Humans hunt bears, not the other way around. We have rifles and technology and opposable thumbs. We're supposed to be the ones in control. But in that moment, none of that mattered. I was just meat, prey, and all the knowledge and skills I'd accumulated over 42 years of life were useless against raw power and instinct. The writing continued for several pages, the words flowing more easily than Michael had expected, as he detailed not just the physical events of the attack, but the emotional and psychological impact it had left in its wake, the fear that still ambushed him at unexpected moments, the way he flinched at sudden movements, even from his own family, the dreams where he was running through endless forest, the sound of the bear always just behind him. When he finally finished, it was well past midnight. He saved the document but didn't print it or send it to anyone. The act of writing itself had been cathartic, organizing the chaotic swirl of thoughts into something tangible, something he could examine from a distance. It hadn't resolved anything, but it had provided a measure of relief, enough that he felt he might be able to sleep without the aid of the anti-anxiety medication still tucked away in his wallet. As the weeks passed, Michael established a routine that accommodated his healing body while providing some sense of purpose to combat the restlessness that grew as his energy began to return. He started taking daily walks around the neighborhood, gradually increasing the distance as his stamina improved. He began visiting the office for short periods, reviewing plans and speaking with clients by phone, though he was careful to defer to Dave on most decisions, recognizing that his partner had earned that courtesy through his handling of the business during Michael's absence. The physical injuries healed according to the expected timeline. The lacerations on his chest and shoulder closed cleanly, leaving vivid red scars that the doctor assured him would fade to silver over time. The concussion symptoms, headaches, dizziness, sensitivity to light, diminished and eventually disappeared entirely. 6 weeks after the surgery, the cast was removed from his arm, revealing pale, atrophied skin and significantly reduced muscle mass, but X-rays confirmed that the bones had knit properly. "You'll need to be diligent with the physical therapy," Dr. Patel emphasized during the follow-up appointment. "The goal is not just to regain strength, but to restore full range of motion. It will be uncomfortable at times, even painful, but it's essential for a complete recovery." Michael committed to the recommended therapy schedule, attending sessions twice weekly at a sports medicine clinic near his home. The work was indeed painful, involving exercises that pushed the limits of his mobility and strength, but he approached it with the same determination he brought to any challenging task. Progress was slow but measurable. A few more degrees of rotation here, a slightly heavier weight there, small victories that accumulated over time. The psychological healing proved less straightforward. The nightmares became less frequent but didn't disappear entirely. Certain triggers, a documentary about wildlife, the sound of breaking branches during a windstorm, even the sight of his own scars in the mirror could still catapult him back to those terrifying moments in the forest. He continued the journaling practice, finding that externalizing his thoughts helped prevent them from cycling endlessly through his mind, and occasionally used the anti-anxiety medication when the symptoms became particularly intense. He didn't speak much about this aspect of his recovery, not even to Karen, though she surely noticed the nights when he woke gasping from dreams, or the way he sometimes froze momentarily when startled. It wasn't a conscious decision to keep these struggles private, more a habitual self-reliance that made vulnerability difficult to express. But as the weeks stretched into months, even this began to shift, a gradual opening up that paralleled his physical healing. It was nearly 3 months after the attack when Bobby suggested they meet for dinner, just the two of them, at a steakhouse they had frequented before the incident. Michael agreed readily, realizing it had been too long since they had spent time together outside of Bobby's occasional visits to check on his recovery. Their friendship had always been based on shared activities, hunting, fishing, watching sports, rather than deep conversations. But the bond had proven its strength in the aftermath of the attack, and Michael felt a renewed appreciation for the relationship. The restaurant was busy for a Thursday evening, the ambient noise of multiple conversations and the clinking of cutlery creating a privacy that allowed for more personal discussion than might otherwise have been comfortable for two men accustomed to expressing their connection through action rather than words. "You're looking better," Bobby observed after they had ordered, his gaze taking in Michael's improved color and the greater ease with which he now moved his left arm. "How's the physical therapy going?" "Brutal but effective," Michael replied with a wry smile. "I've got about 70% range of motion back in the shoulder, and the strength is coming along. Another month or two, and you'd hardly know anything had happened except for the scars." Bobby nodded, seemingly satisfied with the assessment. They chatted about safer topics through the appetizers and into the main course: work, sports, Bobby's tentative reconciliation with his wife following their separation. It wasn't until they were waiting for dessert that Bobby broached the subject that Michael suspected had been his real reason for suggesting the dinner. "So I've been thinking about the fall," Bobby said, his tone deliberately casual as he swirled the remaining whiskey in his glass. "Hunting season will be here before we know it. Peterson mentioned a spot up in the Bitterroots he's had good luck with the last few years, supposedly prime elk territory, and less crowded than where we usually go." The question behind the statement was clear, though Bobby was careful not to phrase it directly. Was Michael ready to consider hunting again? Would the tradition they had maintained for 15 years continue, or had the attack changed things permanently? Michael felt a familiar tightening in his chest at the thought of returning to the wilderness. of being in bear country again. But it was less intense than it had been even a month earlier, the sharp edge of fear dulled by time, and the gradual process of coming to terms with what had happened. "The Bitterroots, huh?" he said, buying time as he considered his response. "That's a pretty serious backcountry trip, lot of hiking involved." Bobby shrugged, accepting the deflection. "Could be, or we could look at something closer to home. There's that area out past Emmett we talked about a couple years back. Might not have the trophy potential of the Salmon Chalice, but the access is easier, and it's closer to medical care if, well, just in case." The acknowledgement of risk, however obliquely stated, was something new in their conversations about hunting. Before the attack, they had both been aware of the potential dangers of backcountry travel, of course, but that awareness had been theoretical, academic, the kind of risk you recognize but don't truly internalize until it materializes. "I've been thinking about it too," Michael admitted, surprising himself with the honesty, "about whether I want to go back out there, whether I can." Bobby waited, not pushing, allowing Michael the space to organize his thoughts. "The first few weeks after it happened, I was sure I was done," Michael continued, his voice low. "The idea of being in the woods again, of hearing those sounds, smelling those smells, it was unthinkable. But lately, I've started to wonder if staying away is really the answer. If giving up something I've loved my whole life because of one bad experience, however traumatic, isn't letting the fear win in a different way. There's no wrong decision here, you." "No," Bobby said, his usual bluff manner softened by genuine concern. "No one would think less of you if you decided hunting wasn't for you anymore. Hell, plenty of guys never go through anything like what you did and still give it up as they get older. Different priorities, different interests. Life changes." Michael nodded, acknowledging the permission being offered. "I know, and I appreciate that. But the thing is, I'm not sure I want to give it up. I miss it. The quiet mornings, the challenge of the stalk, the connection to something older than subdivision and shopping malls. I'm just not sure if those things are worth the risk anymore. Not just to me, but to what it would do to Karen and the kids if something worse happened next time." "Understandable," Bobby agreed. "But risk is part of life, right? You could get hit by a drunk driver tomorrow on your way to work. Lightning could strike your house. A million things could happen that we have no control over. At least with hunting, we can take precautions, be smarter about where we go and how we prepare. Like carrying bear spray and actually having it accessible," Michael suggested with a self-deprecating smile, remembering how his canister had been uselessly stowed in his backpack during the attack. "Exactly," Bobby said, returning the smile. "And maybe we stick together more, no splitting up to cover more ground. Choose our hunting areas more carefully, pack out meat immediately rather than field dressing, and leaving anything that might attract predators. There are ways to reduce the risk without giving up the experience entirely." The conversation continued through dessert and coffee, exploring potential compromises and adjustments that might allow Michael to return to hunting while acknowledging the reality of his heightened awareness of its dangers. No firm decision was reached, both men recognizing that such a choice couldn't and shouldn't be rushed, but the discussion itself felt like progress, an acknowledgement that the attack, while significant, need not be the defining moment of Michael's relationship with the wilderness. As they parted in the restaurant parking lot, Bobby clasped Michael's shoulder with a firm grip, the gesture communicating the depth of feeling that neither man was entirely comfortable putting into words. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you," he said simply. "Whether that means finding new hunting grounds or taking up golf instead, though I gotta warn you, I'm even worse at golf than I am at tracking elk." Michael laughed, the sound surprising him with its genuineness. "I'll keep that in mind. And Bobby, thanks. Not just for tonight, but for everything. I haven't said it enough. And you don't need to say it again," Bobby replied with characteristic gruffness. "That's what friends do." End of story. The conversation with Bobby proved to be a turning point in Michael's recovery, not because it resolved the question of whether he would hunt again, but because it opened the door to discussing the future, rather than remaining fixated on the trauma of the past. Over the following weeks, he found himself more able to engage with the present, to focus on the incremental improvements in his physical condition, and to recognize the gradual easing of the psychological symptoms that had plagued him in the immediate aftermath of the attack. He began to share more of these thoughts with Karen, who listened with the quiet attentiveness that had been one of the foundations of their marriage. She neither encouraged nor discouraged the idea of his returning to hunting, seeming to understand intuitively that this was a decision he needed to reach on his own terms and in his own time. "I just want you to be happy," she said one evening as they sat on the back patio, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. And I want you to be safe, of course, but mostly, I want you to feel like yourself again, whatever that means for you now." "That's the thing," Michael replied, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "I'm not sure I'm the same person I was before, not entirely. When something like that happens, it changes you. The question is whether it's a change you can integrate into who you are, or if it overwhelms everything else." Karen reached over to take his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that had become more precious to him since the moments in the forest when he had thought he might never experience it again. "You're still you," she said softly. "Maybe a different version, with some new scars both visible and invisible, but still essentially Michael. Still the man I married, the father of our children, the person who built this life with me. That hasn't changed, and it won't, regardless of whether you ever pick up a rifle again." Her words stayed with him in the days that followed, a reminder that his identity was not solely defined by any single aspect of his life, whether that was his career, his hobbies, or the traumatic experience that had so recently altered his perspective. He was the sum of many parts, and while the attack had certainly impacted him, it need not dominate his self-conception or determine his future choices. With this evolving understanding came a gradual shift in how he viewed the bear as well. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, the animal had figured in his nightmares as a monster, a malevolent force of pure aggression. But as time passed and the raw emotional impact of the experience began to fade, he found himself considering the encounter with greater objectivity. The bear had not been hunting him, had not sought him out as prey. It had been attracted to the deer carcass, following its natural instincts to secure food in the competitive environment of the wilderness. When confronted with what it perceived as a threat to that food source, or potentially to itself, it had reacted defensively, as wild animals had been doing since long before humans entered their habitats, with guns and expectations of dominance. This reframing didn't minimize the terror or trauma of the attack, but it placed it in a context that made more sense, that aligned with Michael's long-standing respect for the natural world and its inherent neutrality. The bear wasn't evil or good, it simply was, a powerful predator acting according to the imperatives of its existence. The attack had been personal to Michael because he had experienced it, but from the bear's perspective, it had likely been just another day in the constant struggle for survival. 5 months after the attack, Michael received an unexpected phone call from Ranger Collins, the Forest Service employee who had interviewed him in the hospital. She was following up, she explained, as part of the agency's protocol for documented bear encounters resulting in human injury. "We've been monitoring the area where the incident occurred," she told him, her voice professional, but not impersonal. "Based on tracking, scat analysis and trail camera images, we believe we've identified the bear involved in your attack." Michael felt a sudden tension in his shoulders, a physical manifestation of the complex emotions stirred by this connection to the animal that had so profoundly affected his life. Did you have to euthanize it?" he asked, surprised by the ambivalence he felt about the possibility. "No," Ranger Collins replied, given the circumstances of the encounter, the presence of the deer carcass, the defensive rather than predatory nature of the attack, and the fact that there have been no subsequent aggressive interactions with humans in that area, the decision was made to leave the bear in its territory. It appears that the wound it sustained during the incident was not severe enough to significantly impact its ability to hunt or survive. Michael wasn't sure how to respond. Part of him had assumed, without really examining the assumption, that the bear would have been removed one way or another, either relocated to a more remote area or euthanized as a potential threat to other humans. The knowledge that it still roamed the same forests where he had nearly lost his life stirred a complex mixture of emotions that he couldn't immediately untangle. "I thought you might want to know," Ranger Collins continued, perhaps interpreting his silence as displeasure. "Some people find it helpful to have this kind of closure, but if you'd rather not discuss it further, I completely understand." "No, it's fine," Michael assured her. "I appreciate the follow-up. It's just strange to think about it still being out there, going about its bear business as if nothing happened. Strange, but not necessarily bad," he added, realizing as he spoke that this was true. It was just doing what bears do. "I was the one who was in the wrong place at the wrong time." "That's a remarkably balanced perspective," Ranger Collins said, a note of approval in her voice. "Many people in your position would feel differently. In fact, we often face pressure to remove bears involved in attacks, even when the circumstances don't warrant such measures from a wildlife management standpoint. "I've had some time to think about it," Michael said simply, "and I guess I've come to see the whole thing differently than I did at first. Less personal, more ecological, I suppose you could say." The conversation with Ranger Collins proved to be another step in Michael's evolving relationship with the memory of the attack. The knowledge that the bear continued to exist, neither villainized nor removed from its natural habitat because of an encounter that was, from a certain perspective, as much Michael's responsibility as the bear's, helped solidify his understanding of the event as part of the inherent risk of entering wilderness areas rather than an exceptional occurrence requiring retribution or dramatic management action. As spring gave way to summer, Michael's physical recovery continued to progress. The physical therapy sessions paid dividends in increased strength and mobility, and while he still experienced occasional twinges of pain in his arm and shoulder, during certain movements, these were minor compared to the limitations he had faced in the early months of healing. The scars remained vivid against his skin, but as Dr. Patel had predicted, they were beginning to fade from angry red to a softer pink. The psychological effects lingered as well, though in increasingly subtle forms. The nightmares had become rare, occurring perhaps once or twice a month rather than several times weekly. The startle response that had made him jump at unexpected noises had moderated to a more normal level of alertness. He still found himself avoiding certain triggers, documentary footage of bear attacks, for instance, or conversations about wilderness, survival in extreme circumstances, but these avoidance behaviors didn't significantly impact his daily life or relationships. By late July, Michael had returned to work full-time, though he was still avoiding the more physically demanding aspects of construction in favor of design, client consultation, and project management. The arrangement had proven unexpectedly beneficial for the business, as it forced a more equitable distribution of responsibilities between Michael and Dave and provided opportunities for their more experienced employees to take on greater leadership roles in the field. It was during this period of relative stability and gradual return to normalcy that Michael found himself increasingly drawn to making a decision about the upcoming hunting season. The question had remained open since his conversation with Bobby months earlier, neither man pushing for a definitive answer, but both aware that planning would need to begin soon if they intended to maintain their annual tradition. One evening in early August, Michael found himself alone in his home office, ostensibly reviewing plans for an upcoming kitchen renovation, but actually gazing out the window at the summer twilight, his thoughts far from cabinet specifications and tile selections. On impulse, he opened his laptop and navigated to a folder of photos from previous hunting trips, images of himself and Bobby in various wilderness settings, sometimes accompanied by other friends, sometimes just the two of them, always with the backdrop of Idaho's magnificent landscapes. He scrolled through the photos slowly, memories washing over him with each image. There they were at a campsite in the Frank Church wilderness, Bobby demonstrating his questionable culinary skills over a camp stove. There was Michael with his first elk, the pride evident in his stance despite the exhaustion of the pack-out that had followed. Photo after photo of mountains and valleys, of early morning mist rising from rivers, of the simple camaraderie of men who shared an appreciation for wild places and the challenges they presented. Without fully forming the conscious decision, Michael reached for his phone and dialed Bobby's number. When his friend answered, the words came easily, naturally, as if they had been waiting just beneath the surface for the right moment to emerge. "I've been thinking about that spot in the Bitterroots Peterson mentioned," he said without preamble. "Might be worth checking out this season. If the offer's still open, that is." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, then Bobby's voice, warm with poorly concealed enthusiasm, but careful not to overreact. "Yeah, definitely still open. Peterson said it's about a 3-hour drive from Boise, then maybe a 5-mile hike to the area he recommended. Not too bad in terms of access." "Sounds manageable," Michael replied, surprised by the calm certainty he felt about the decision. "We should look at the maps, figure out the best approach. And I'd want to make some changes to how we do things. Stay closer together, carry bear spray, and have it accessible, that kind of thing." "Absolutely," Bobby agreed immediately. "Whatever makes you comfortable. We could even look into those portable electric fences some guys use around their camps in grizzly country. Probably overkill for the Bitterroots, but if it helps with peace of mind." The conversation continued, shifting into the practical details of planning a backcountry hunt. Gear lists, physical preparation, logistics. As they talked, Michael felt a sense of rightness settle over him, an acknowledgement that this decision, while not without its complexities and lingering anxieties, was ultimately aligned with who he was and who he wanted to continue to be. When he ended the call sometime later, he sat quietly for a few moments, letting the implications of the choice fully register. He would return to the wilderness, to the forests and mountains where he had experienced both the greatest joy and the most profound terror of his life. He would carry with him the memory of the attack, the awareness of vulnerability it had imprinted on him, but he would not allow that memory to define his relationship with wild places or to dictate the boundaries of his life. As if to punctuate this realization, Michael's gaze fell on a framed quote that hung on his office wall, words from the naturalist John Muir that had always resonated with him. "The mountains are calling, and I must go." The simplicity of the statement belied the complexity of what it represented, the human need for connection to something larger, something wilder, something that existed beyond the constructed safety of civilization. The bear that had attacked him was still out there, or if not that specific bear, then others like it. Powerful wild creatures following the imperatives of their nature in a landscape that made no special accommodation for human presence. And now Michael would go out there too, not in ignorance of the risks but with a fuller understanding of them, an understanding that included both respect for the potential dangers and a deep appreciation for the privilege of moving through spaces that remained essentially untamed. In the end, the decision wasn't about defying fear or proving something to himself or others. It was simply about reclaiming a part of his identity that had been temporarily overshadowed by trauma, but not erased by it. The bear had taken something from him on that October morning, his sense of invulnerability perhaps, or his unexamined assumption of dominance in the natural world, but it had not taken his capacity to heal, to adapt, and ultimately to return to the wilderness with both humility and courage. As dusk deepened into night outside his window, Michael closed the laptop, the decision made and settled. He would call Karen in from the living room soon, share his choice with her, and together they would navigate whatever emotions it might stir for both of them. But for now he sat quietly in the growing darkness, feeling more at peace than he had in many months, the memory of the bear still present but no longer overwhelming, just one thread in the complex tapestry of a life lived fully, with all its beauty and pain, its triumph and vulnerability, its wild uncertainty and its moments of perfect clarity. And somewhere in the forests of the Salmon Chalice, as twilight settled over the mountains, the bear that had briefly intersected Michael's life in such a profound way continued its own existence, hunting, foraging, following the ancient rhythms of a world where such encounters, however momentous to the humans involved, were simply part of the natural order, neither good nor evil, but merely the inevitable result of two species sharing a landscape that belonged in the end to neither of them, but to which both in their different ways belonged.